good morning, afternoon, or evening, and welcome to the Bloody Disgusting Network. The following show is just horrifying. Beware.
Sheriff, you're not cheating on your wife if you eat my lemon square.
Your lemon squares taste like ass.
And welcome back to Horror Queers. We're talking What's Your Pleasure, Sir? We're talking Come to Daddy. And we're talking Julia fucking Cotton. And I'm Joe.
And I'm Trace, and we're talking We'll Tear Your Soul Apart.
Oh boy. It sounds like a gay come-on, but I'm sure in 1987 it was very scary.
Oh, I'm sure it was, everyone, because we are talking Clive Barker's directorial debut, Hellraiser. Just a mere 1 year after discussing Hellraiser 3, Hell on Earth.
Yeah, we like to do things in order, don't we?
Oh my god, we're so bad about that. We always jump right to the sequels, but Joe, I'm surprised we did it with that one, if only because this is your movie, right?
It is indeed, yes. I mean, folks, of course, we're celebrating the 35th anniversary of the film, which is partially why we held off on doing it for this long. But yeah, this is my fucking baby. I've been waiting, like, with bated breath for ages and ages to talk about this movie.
It's like your Scooby-Doo.
Yeah, it really is. And also, thank you for getting in a fucking mention of Scooby-Doo, like, 30 seconds in.
I mean, I'm sure I'll do it again, because as we all know, Scooby-Doo does reference Hellraiser sometimes.
This is true.
But anyway, well, Joe, I'm very happy that we finally get to discuss what is a film that's pretty formative to your evolution as a horror fan, is it not?
Absolutely. Yeah, this is one of the two films that really sparked my interest in the genre. Of course, folks can go back and listen to my horror origin story, but yeah, it was basically Clive Barker double bill, Candyman, and this.
So fascinating. But you know what? I think we need someone else to help us parse through the many layers to what sounds like a simple film, but honestly is not a simple film.
No. Very complicated, surprisingly enough.
So everyone, let's bring in our guest who's waiting in the wings. He is a horror journalist with bylines at Daily Dead, Rue Morgue, and Cinepunks. He is the co-host of the Corpse Club, the official podcast of Daily Dead that does deep dives into the world of horror entertainment. You may also know him from our previous episode on the aforementioned Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth from last year. Please welcome Bryan Christopher.
Howdy, gents. How's it going?
Welcome back. And it is hellish.
Oh.
I could not think of a pun for that. I'm sorry.
Well, I'm pretty convinced that I was mainly invited on here just because you know the giant temper tantrum I would have thrown had I heard this episode and been like, wait, they did Hellraiser and I wasn't invited? What the absolute fuck? Like,
the
it would have been
the entitlement.
I'm a white American man. Of course I'm entitled. Like,
there we go. I let you say it as opposed to me.
For once.
That's true. I'm actually getting reviews on the podcast about it now, so yay.
Yeah, you are. You are racist against white people. That is Joe. That is
this
Joe.
This is true. Yes. I will accept that.
I've been saying it for years.
Okay, Bryan, so we talked about this a bit in Hellraiser 3 Hell on Earth, but why do you want to keep coming back to talk about this shit?
Because it's my baby. Like,
yes.
It is my gateway to the genre. It is the movie that has stuck with me the absolute longest. Like, this is one, and I think I've heard Joe's origin story on this too, and I think we have something similar where we saw it way too young. Like, my first memories of seeing a movie are the beginning of Hellraiser, and I'm talking like 4 or 5 years old. Like, growing up in a household where it's like parents did not give a shit like what I saw, and it was kind of one of those things where like they, I think, turned it into a philosophy later where like they didn't want to shield me, but I think it was mainly they didn't want to have to edit the things that they were watching. So they just said, fuck it, let's let them watch.
That's the kind of parent I would be.
I thought you were going to say, they realize, we've already scarred our child, so we should probably just now turn it into a parenting philosophy.
But yeah, this is a movie that has grown up with me. I mean, not that it's changed, but my understanding of it has changed as I've gotten older. You know, because as a kid, well, first it's terrifying and scarring, but then it's oddly intriguing. You're looking at these awful monsters that are also extremely attractive in like aesthetically, and as I get older, I realize also maybe sexually. And few movies have done that with me, where like it's never stopped at a point in time where everything I'm going to get out of this movie like stops at a certain age. It just keeps evolving as kind of my sensibilities and my mind evolves.
I feel the exact same way too. Like this most recent rewatch just for this episode, I was like, wait, I'm still taking new things away from this movie.
Well, so Joe, give us a brief recap again on how you discovered this film. But I really want to know, like, why does this film speak to you so much? Because this isn't just, it's one of the first horror movies I saw. Like, you adore this movie.
I absolutely do. Yeah. So, I mean, the logline isn't much more sophisticated than that. Like, my sister and I used to watch movies together, but whenever my parents would leave and she was stuck babysitting me, she, I think, disliked the fact, so she would rent horror movies to try to scare me and entertain me. And yeah, the first one was this Clive Barker double bill. And I feel like what it ended up doing was confirming to me that a certain type of horror existed. My introduction to the genre wasn't really schlocky 80s horror in the vein of Friday the 13th. It wasn't legacy sequels. Like, I wasn't watching Nightmare on Elm Street and Jason Voorhees and all the other folks. It was these kinds of movies, like deep, sophisticated, sexy films. And so I kind of ended up training myself to think that this was what horror should be. Like, horror could be deeply metaphorical, it could be classical, it could be operatic, it could be melodramatic. And I do think that that's sometimes why I go back and look at older films and I don't always appreciate them the way that folks do. And I'm speaking mostly from the 80s because I'm a child of the 80s. But yeah, I don't know. Hellraiser just always struck me as so creative. And then, of course, as I began to realize that I was queer, I saw so much of myself in Clive Barker's work. And Hellraiser is really, to me, the kind of pinnacle of queer horror perfection. Like, nearly every character in this film in particular is queer. Like, or queered in some way, or othered. And I think that there's such a fascination with that. And yeah, I end up seeing a lot of myself in Barker's work overall, as we've talked about in both Nightbreed and Lord of Illusions. But Hellraiser is the one that speaks to me most strongly.
Yeah, no, I can already hear the naysayers in the audience. The very few naysayers we have that are like, everyone's queer in this movie, Joe, really? But I'm sure we're gonna go deep, deep, deep into that.
And to that, I will say, yes, everyone is fucking queer in this movie.
So queer.
Yeah, interesting. Do y'all find that this franchise, and maybe we'll even just say these first two, but I think people always judge it as a franchise because, and you know, it has this stigma of being a really bad franchise. But y'all, again, it is really just everything post. For some people, post 2. For some people, post 3. For some people, like Joe, post 4.
Yeah, and I think there's even interesting things in some of the later films. It's just that the people who are making those films, and I think we talk about this a little bit in Bloodline, particularly because we talk about it as the last theatrical film in the franchise. But yeah, I think there's always interesting ideas. It's just that they sort of lose the plot. Like, they turn it into just a film noir with a Cenobite who shows up every once in a while. And that's the power of especially these first two films. They seem to have an uncanny understanding of when to use the Cenobites and then when to get them the fuck off screen and focus on the true monsters, which are Julia Cotton and Frank.
That's the thing, though. I feel like so many people that either kind of brush off this franchise or they're like, ooh, that's not for me, it's too intense or whatever. I don't even think they know what this franchise, or this first movie anyway, is about. Because I actually told some people about it yesterday who were not really horror fans, but they knew Pinhead because she's on all the box art.
Of course.
And when I told them the plot of this movie, they were like, I had no fucking idea that's what that movie was about.
Yeah. Yeah, I like to joke that this film is actually a melodrama, and it just happens to have monsters in it.
I mean, Clive Barker himself described it as a perverse love story, which again,
yes, absolutely.
When you're looking at this box, you're like, oh, Hellraiser, it's the Pinhead, it's the torture movie. Like, you would not think that going in.
Mm-hmm. And Clive Barker is actually on the record as saying, like, he fucking hates torture porn films, so he would be absolutely aghast to hear anyone say, oh, this is comparable to Saw or something like that.
Why do y'all think... Okay, before we go into the production of this film, so why do you think that is? Like, what is the difference between torture porn? And I'm asking kind of like, I don't know, because I kind of know, but I don't know. What is the difference between torture porn and then what we have on display with the gore and violence in this film, the sadomasochism?
If I may,
mm-hmm.
torture porn, and when I think torture porn, I think about movies like, I mean, I guess Hostel is usually
mm-hmm.
the one that pops into most people's minds. I think Saw, some people think of Saw as torture porn. I don't even know if I would consider Saw torture porn. I actually think torture porn is a much narrower subgenre than a lot of people think of.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, torture porn is about lingering on cringe-inducing shots and making you like just dwell on the pain. And
mm-hmm.
yes, you know, you could argue that that's a lot of what Hellraiser is about. Like, these Cenobites are all about pain, but the difference for me is that there is much more of that kink element where they're talking
mm-hmm.
about the intersection of pleasure and pain. And you don't have like those scenes like you do in Hostel where it's like there's no music, you're just going to watch this guy get like his Achilles tendon get slashed, and you're just going to watch him get like, you know, chunks of his skin gouged out. Like, for as much as they talk about pain and for as gory and splattery as this is, they don't linger the way that torture porn does in a kind of, for lack of a better term, seedy way that I think torture porn does.
It's interesting, too, because even watching this last night, I've seen this movie at least 5 times. And you're right, it is very gory, it is very gooey. But yeah, it doesn't seem to relish in that. But at the same time, I was the most uncomfortable I've ever been watching this movie last night. And most of it is because of how much they don't show. And I actually I felt very uncomfortable watching this. And again, I hadn't really felt that before. And I don't know what was different about my state of mind, or if I just have aged more and my mindset's a bit different. But I kind of liken this to the same feeling I get with cosmic horror, where it's like that feel of the fear of the unknown. Like, so much of what happens to the characters in this movie, I'm like, this is legitimately terrifying. Like, Frank aside, like, you know, because whatever. But Kirsty, even, I'm just like, oh, I would be dead. I would be dead if I was a member of this movie.
Yeah, it's weird because I feel like so much of what we see in horror, and particularly like domestic horror, which was very popular in the 80s, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, I'm thinking of things like Poltergeist or even Arachnophobia, where it's about like suburban domestic spaces that get infiltrated by horrific things and people's everyday life gets upended. And this is kind of the same, but we're talking about, yeah, it almost is cosmic, right? Like, we're talking about beings from a completely different dimension. And while Kirsty isn't my favorite character, I have grown to appreciate her arc in this film more. But if you look at what these characters are dealing with, these are mundane things, right? Like, it's adultery, it's mild incest, it's about Kirsty trying to break away from her overbearing father so that she can live on her own, for fuck's sake. And into this, you introduce the pleasure and pain eternal of creatures who care not for your daily problems. And there's something so interesting about how the largeness of the scale intersects with like the mundane reality of everyday human life.
Well, okay. So why don't we go into how this film came to be? Because I, honestly, even for the 80s, I look at this and I'm like, how did this get made? Mm-hmm. So
in the UK, that's how.
Well, and funnily, and I'll elaborate on this more when we get to the reception, but American critics weren't very fond of this film, but UK critics were very fond of this film.
We're a bunch of Puritans. What do you want?
There is that. This is a sexy movie.
But it's also very gory, which again, that's where I'm kind of I get the American thing, because again, this is a bizarre movie. But we know that the Brits also aren't very fond of violence, and maybe it was the intertwining of sex with that where they were like, oh, okay, it's okay. But by the mid-'80s, Clive Barker, of course, famed queer horror creator Clive Barker, had 2 cinematic abominations made from his story, and those are his words. We had 1985's Underworld, which I have never seen, and 1986's Raw Head Rex. He took this as a sign, as if God was telling him he should direct his own film. So he somehow came into contact with a man named Christopher Figg, who would become his producer on what would become Hellraiser. Barker asked him what is the least amount of money he could spend and expect someone to hire a first-time director. Figg gave him these parameters. Under $1 million, you need a house, some monsters, and pretty much unknown actors. And there you go. Barker decided to write the story as a novella, which would become The Hellbound Heart. And he decided to do this before he even wrote a script because it allowed him to first translate his vision onto the page in a format with which he was entirely comfortable, because he struggled with that when doing Underworld and Rawhead Rex.
See, that's so interesting because I didn't know, like, I always thought it was a fast turnaround because, Hellbound Heart comes out in 86 and then he's already got Hellraiser out in 87.
Yep.
So I was just like, that was a really fast turnaround. I didn't realize, for all the shit that I know about this movie, I didn't realize that he literally wrote the novella, I guess, as like a transition into writing a screenplay for the movie.
It's just extra work too, right? But I mean, honestly, it worked.
Well, and it works because he gets to also publish this as a book, which stands on its own. And if folks want to hear a little bit more about what this looks like as an adaptation, I'm going to do a gentle plug. Bryan and I actually have a limited series podcast on the Anatomy of a Scream Pod Squad, which actually tackles the Hellraiser books and how that feeds into the film. So if you want to learn more about that, except for that factoid which you just informed us of, Trace, you could go and check out Such Sights to Show on the Anatomy of a Scream Pod Squad.
Well, Joe, that was the only one we had. That was it. So actually, we just ruined the whole series. Yeah, it was. I don't really know what we did in the other 3 hours, but I think that's the only actual tidbit that came out of it.
Right. Yeah.
Well, I will say, because I forgot to give my credit my source at the top of this, but I'm pulling a lot of this information from an interview with Clive Barker with The Guardian. It's called How We Made Hellraiser from 2017, but also the very thick and dense booklet that comes with Arrow's Scarlet box set of the first 3 films, which, as we noted in our episode on Hellraiser 3 and maybe even Bloodline, that this is out of print.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I searched again today. Nope. No box set for you.
God, we're ridiculous. We both don't have, like, we are both the biggest Hellraiser fans on the planet, and neither of us have that box set. Because I think it was probably, we were both going like, well, I'll get it. I'm sure the price will go down, and then I'll get it then. Oh, it's gone completely. Never to be seen again. Awesome.
Man.
Awesome.
Any sets, be it this set, that the Scream Factory, like Halloween or Friday the 13th sets, like any of that shit, you have to get that shit in the first year because you never know when the rights are going to fuck and they have to go out of print.
Yeah, you just got to gobble it up.
Yeah, just credit cards, man. Just use your credit cards.
Oh my God, no! This is not a financial
Great financial
podcast.
advice.
Do not condone.
Financial advice from Trace Thurman. Just use your credit cards. Nothing bad can happen.
God.
So, okay. Barker also determined that this would fulfill his already committed contribution to a groundbreaking new anthology series from Dark Harvest. Because you see, earlier in 1985, he had been invited to write 30,000 words for their 3rd volume of that series, which was called Night Visions. So this is very much a 2 birds, 1 stone situation for Barker.
Love it.
Funnily enough, though, that volume of that anthology was edited by none other than George R.R. Martin, so they became buds while working on that.
Who knew?
That seems like it'd be a weird pairing.
Well, he hadn't written Game of Thrones yet, so maybe R.R. Martin was still figuring out all of his shit. So anyway, he wrote the novella again with the specific intention of filming it. This would be the first and only time Barker did this. He wrote 1 draft of the screenplay by December 31st, 1985, and then he did another draft in January of 86. His original vision for The Hellbound Heart, which again is the name of the novella, was a romance, a story of intense passion and desire, with a puzzle and the consequences of solving that puzzle as devices to explore the perversity and depth of those human desires. It's a conscious striving to make sense of the Faust story, aka that of a German necromancer or astrologer who sells his soul to the devil in exchange for knowledge and power. And again, Barker described this mix of all that as a perverse love story.
Sure. And we see it turn up in horror and horror-adjacent titles all the time. See our former episode on Phantom of the Paradise.
I mean, you can even think, I'm going to just say it away from horror, Indiana Jones and the Kingdom of the Crystal... Actually, any of those movies, really. All the bad guys die because they want, like, more power and knowledge.
Always.
The inspiration from the story came from Barker himself, who worked as a hustler in the 1970s because he had no money. Believing that sex is a great leveler, his experiences there made him want to tell a story about good and evil in which sexuality was the connective tissue. And he believed that most English and American horror stories were not sexual, or if they were playful about it. He used the word coquettish, which sounds very just inherently British to me.
I love that.
Such a Clive Barker word.
Right? Yes, exactly.
He was just tired of seeing a bunch of teenagers having sex and then getting killed. So, Joe, very much your mentality about the Friday the 13th franchise.
There we go. And I'm not passing shade.
No, I know. Barker probably was.
Yeah, probably.
Fig and Barker sought out to attract interest in the novella from potential financiers. So, after expanding into film production with notable successes in the early 80s, British entrepreneur Richard Branson's Virgin Films, and this is like Virgin, like the Virgin studio, consequently would announce in 1983, a couple years prior to this, that they would be investing £14 million in a series of movies, and by 1986, they had developed an interest in The Hellbound Heart with the prospect of developing it into a feature film. Eventually, and I guess they all met at Cannes somehow, because an announcement was made at the May 1986 Cannes Film Festival that Roger Corman's New World Pictures would be co-financing and co-producing this film with Virgin.
Jesus Christ. Can you imagine Richard Branson, George R.R. Martin, like Roger Corman?
Is this a setup for a joke?
Right?
walk into a film festival.
So what an absolutely bizarre group of people to help Clive Barker bring this to the screen.
So bizarre, right? Well, I guess it was a little too bizarre because Virgin drops out as a producer. And I couldn't really figure out why. I'm sorry, I could figure out why, because they were like, oh yeah, they didn't like a lot of the imagery we were sending them for the film. But I'm also kind of like, you read the novella.
And the novella is, like, hella weird and sexual. Like, the opening pages of what Frank does and goes through is incredibly descriptive and very violent and sexual.
I mean, I wonder if it was a thing where maybe they were looking at this, because you forget how innovative Hellraiser is. So maybe they're reading this book and like, they're never going to be able to adapt all that. Like, they're going to have to do something, at least on a practical level, to make this a little bit more palatable. Mm-hmm. And Clive Barker went, fuck you. Yeah. and he pulled it off with, less than $1 million.
Well, that scared Virgin a lot. But nevertheless, so they were worried, both Barker and Fig, because they're like, fuck, because New World had only agreed to do half of the production and financing. And luckily for them, they stepped up to the plate and said, you know what, fuck it. We're going to pay all £900,000 of this, and we're going to do it for you. Now, I want to point out, so this is £900,000. I did the conversion here. That is about $2.9 million today.
That's just shockingly low. It's so low for what we get.
Here, that's the thing, and I know we lament CGI. I know that I have less of a problem with bad CGI than you do, Joe, but it's the thing where I'm like, well, some of these Blumhouse movies that are getting made for $5 million, why can't they do practical effects work like this?
I think it's still like a lost art, right? I mean, practical effects were what you did back in the day. It was like matte work and practical effects, and maybe if you were lucky, you could afford a Tom Savini type. But I think nowadays it must be cheaper to do FX, but also the FX look cheaper.
Yeah, maybe it's like how like physical media is becoming like a niche group. That's the same thing with practical effects people, and because of that, they're getting more expensive.
Maybe. Yeah.
I don't know. Barker, being a first-time filmmaker, he is open about his lack of knowledge on filmmaking, saying he didn't know the difference between a 10mm lens and a 35mm lens. If you showed him a plate of spaghetti and said that was a lens, he might have even believed you. The week before filming started, he went to the library to get a book about directing. They had one, but it was out, so he was lucky. So he walked onto set without having read any books about directing. He was winging everything here. He didn't know any of the terminology. He was just like, do this, do this, do this. Luckily, the crew was very gracious and gentle with him, and helping him out was his editor, Richard Martin, who had worked with David Lean, and you may know him as the director of films like Lawrence of Arabia and Dr. Zhivago.
Oh, sure. Little films.
He also had Bob Keane on hand to do the special effects of the film, and Bob Keane had done special effects on Star Wars, and he was the one who came up with Frank's resurrection scene. So they all had a really good working rhythm. There was very little, if any, conflict between people on this set, which again, given the subject matter, is kind of surprising. With pre-production complete and given 7 weeks to shoot, Clive delivered the shooting script on July 26, 1986, and added more revisions, minor revisions, on September 22nd of 1986. Principal photography got underway in London that September at a small house in Dollis Hill and a small production studio in Cricklewood. The film was shot almost entirely in sequence, which isn't often done, and I have to believe that might have been Clive Barker's lack of knowledge on filming.
Yeah, I wonder, too, if they wanted to get some of the hardest sequences out of the way first, because a lot of the gore is at the beginning of the film, right?
Yeah. I mean, nevertheless, I don't know. I mean, I don't know if someone was like, Clive, they don't really do things like this anymore.
He's like, well, this is how I visualized it.
Well, initially, New World Pictures was fine. They were not too involved with the production. They were like, hey, you got our money, do your thing, because you're Clive Barker, do it. But about 3 weeks through the 6-week shoot, Stephen White, the studio executive viewing the footage, made a decision that the production needed more day-to-day management and summoned his colleague, Tony Randall, asking him to get on a plane to London and work alongside Fig and Barker in getting the visual impact of the written screenplay onto film. This caused a few problems. People were like, oh god, now we have the suit coming in. And Randall did require more reshoots to redo some of the effects work in the film. And this caused a bit of tension, but luckily Randall secured the extra funds for this. So he was like, you know what, I'm asking you to do this, I'll get you the money for it. You have to worry about finding a new budget for this.
Which, thank goodness.
Oh, absolutely. Now, this did extend principal photography by 3 weeks, so we have a 10-week shoot now. But he also convinced New World Pictures to add extra money, specifically to pay for an additional week of special effects reshoots to allow a more spectacular Birth of Frank sequence, as well as other effects enhancements. The goal was to make the picture more beautiful as the imagery became more unpleasant. So when he saw this footage, he was like, ooh, some of these gore shots aren't shot extremely well, so I want to redo them.
That was a good investment.
Right? Can you imagine what the original look for Frank's resurrection would have been like? I don't know. During post-production, they made Barker relocate the story to America and overdub some of the accents, which Barker didn't love because the original story had been so English, but again, he had a lot of respect for Randall by this point.
It's just so funny because when you look at the finished film, it is so British. We're not doing a good job of hiding it, except for the voices overdubbed.
Well, because it's the voice of Frank who's dubbed over, which honestly I was like, God, his whole performance, but honestly, the actor that plays Frank,
he is really good.
Well, Sean Chapman, he's only playing this role when he's not skinless. When he's skinless, it's an entirely different actor playing this role.
Yes.
The film was originally made under the working title of Sadomasochist from Beyond the Grave, which was Barker's preferred title. When they said that is not okay, he wanted to call the film Hellbound, but Fig said, do Hellraiser instead. Obviously, Barker wanted Hellbound because of his novella, but Fig thought that was, and this is weird, too negative?
Oh, okay.
He thought that Hellraiser was a better title because it's about something coming at you instead of you going towards something, which, okay. Yeah. Unfortunately, before Hellraiser could get released, it had to go up against the ratings board and censors. It was
too many thrusts.
Oh my god, yes.
Yep.
So I know y'all already know all this shit, but our listeners do not. Hellraiser was initially banned in Ontario by the Ontario Film and Video Review Board by a 3-2 majority vote. The film was deemed not approved in its entirety as it contravenes community standards. It was banned because of its brutal graphic violence with bloodletting throughout, horror, degradation, and torture.
Please.
In August of 1987, it was passed by the Ontario Film Review Board, but only after several cuts were made to the film. New World Mutual of Canada cut about 40 seconds to get it passed with an R rating, 35 seconds of an extended torture scene featuring hooks pulling apart Frank's body, or actually, that might have been Larry's body, and face were removed, as well as a scene of squirming rats nailed to a wall, which that definitely is in the version I saw.
Yeah.
And Trace, did you say 3 to 5 seconds or 35 seconds?
35 seconds.
Oh my God. That almost seems like it would be excessive. 35 seconds of just the hooks pulling on Andrew Robinson's skin.
So the thing is that I think with Andrew Robinson's character, I feel like that was probably fine. The way that Frank's opening scene is shot, I have to feel like that's where it was, because you only see the close-ups of the three hooks, various hooks, and then he's
very fast.
We're done.
And that does make sense that there would be more of a montage, kind of similar to what they cut out of Event Horizon, where clearly they had a lot of footage that they could have gone to, but they had to trim it down to the flashes you see. You definitely get that same sense in Hellraiser with Frank's hole when he's describing what he went through. Like, they probably shot a bunch of stuff. So yeah, I guess that makes a little bit more sense.
But honestly, for effect's sake, I think, because again, normally I'm like, no, I want to see this shit. Like, I want to see what's happening. But since this is the first scene, I think it makes more sense to show us the before, the hooks, and then just what the aftermath is as we move into kind of the mystery of what this is as we go forward.
Yeah.
But anyway, so Canada was not the only place this film had problems. In the United States, the MPAA gave the film an X rating, and so I do have a list of cuts here. The seduction scene between Julia and Frank was initially a lot more explicit. It had some spanking in it that the MPAA hated, so they had to cut that out.
Okay.
They told him he was allowed 2 consecutive buttock thrusts from Frank, but 3 was deemed obscene.
Oh my God.
2.5 shots were excised from the first hammer murder, including a close-up of the hammer lodged in the victim's head. In the scene where Julia murders another man, the actor playing the victim felt that it made sense for him to do so naked. The nude murder scene was shot, but ultimately replaced with a semi-clothed version to appease the MPAA.
Yeah, that wouldn't have flown.
Close-ups of Kirsty sticking her hand into Frank's stomach, exposing his guts, were cut out, which I'm a little bummed about that, because that is not shown well enough in the final cut.
Yeah.
Barker actually did go on record, though, saying their main issues were less to do with the violence of the film and more to do with the film's more erotic scenes. So, again, that spanking was the issue, and the thrusts and whatever. They were like, no. Get the sodomy out of there, but it's okay. Bring in the knife. We're good.
Yeah,
I mean,
for sure.
is there any more, like, quintessential American sensibility? Like, can you maybe come back on the sex and maybe just kill a few more people? That'll be fun, right? The kids will like that.
I don't talk about the soundtrack that much, but this, again, in a what could have been scenario, because Barker originally wanted the English experimental electronic music group Coil to perform the music for the film, but that notion was flat out rejected by New World. And I really want to know what that music was going to be, because I will say that they get Christopher Young to do the score for this, and he was suggested by Tony Randall, again, who's helping him out with all this, because he had heard his work on Nightmare on Elm Street Part 2 and Tobe Hooper's Invaders from Mars. I love Young's score for this movie.
Oh, yes.
I have to wonder what the vibe of this Coil band would have been like.
Yeah, I wonder if it would have been more punk and more sort of alternative, because you very much get the impression that a lot of the vibe of this film, drawing from Barker's personal experiences, would have been sort of like that underground S&M kind of scene, right? So I could imagine an alternative kind of electronica vibe.
Yeah, I'm almost picturing like the soundtrack from Knife and Heart or something along those lines.
Maybe, but even then I'm like, I don't think that fits this very well. But I mean, again, because Barker, getting inspiration from his S&M club days. I mean, he was like, oh yeah, it was the first time I saw people getting pierced for fun, and I was introduced to blood spitting that day. So I just wonder if it was maybe the music he heard in the club, so that was the vibe he wanted.
Yeah, I could imagine.
Christopher Young, by the way, would make many return trips to Hell, because he did score Hellbound Hellraiser 2, and about 20 years later, Sam Raimi's Drag Me to Hell.
There we go.
Hellraiser had its first public showing at the Prince Charles Cinema on September 10th, 1987, and received a wide release in the United States a little over a week later on September 18th, where it opened up against fellow newcomers Fatal Attraction, The Pickup Artist, and The Principal. It opened in the number 3 spot with $4.5 million. Now, for comparison's sake, Fatal Attraction was number 1 with $7.7 million, but that movie stayed in the number 1 spot for 8 weeks and went on to gross $156 million.
Apparently she wouldn't be ignored.
That movie's a fucking juggernaut, so...
Could you imagine a movie today staying in the... Well, I guess maybe Spider-Man had that, but staying in the number 1 spot for 8 weeks.
Yeah, unheard of.
Hellraiser was not so lucky, but since it had a budget of under, £1 million, it didn't matter. It went on to gross $14.6 million domestically and almost $800,000 in the UK. Critical reception was mostly positive. We are looking at a 71% on Rotten Tomatoes with an average score of 6.5 out of 10. Letterboxd users have given it a score of 7 out of 10. As I said earlier, the UK was a bit more polite and kind to this movie. We've got Barker's dazzling debut creates such an atmosphere of dread that the astonishing set pieces simply detonate in a chain reaction of cumulative intensity. A serious, intelligent, and disturbing horror film. The best horror film ever to be made in Britain. Mm-hmm. Whereas in the US, we've got a cast of singularly uninteresting actors.
Wow.
The special effects aren't bad, only damp. A dark, frequently disturbing and occasionally terrifying film. Some critics critiqued the framing of close-ups and the generic score. Again, I don't understand that. The film falls apart at its climax. And then, of course, Roger Ebert, I'll give him the longest blurb here, gives the film 1/2 of a star out of 4 and called it as dreary a piece of goods as has masqueraded as horror and many a long, cold night. This is one of those movies you sit through with mounting dread as the fear grows inside of you that it will indeed turn out to be feature length. This is a movie without wit, style, or reason, and the true horror is that actors were made to portray and technicians to realize its bankruptcy of imagination.
See, and then people wonder why I don't like Roger Ebert, and it's just like, it's shit like that. I literally don't know what movie he's watching, because none of that applies.
Like, I get what he contributed to film criticism, and there are, like, a lot of things about his personality I like, but he was such a wiener when it came to horror movies. Like, he was just... I mean, they're both infamous for both he and Siskel just like tore into like the old like Friday the 13th movies and all those kinds of things. Which, you know, if you want to have that argument, I'll have that argument. But to say that Hellraiser is lacking in imagination, based off of what? I have like, where have you ever seen anything like this before?
I mean, that's the thing, like, the bankruptcy of imagination. You can say you don't like it, but to say there's no imagination on display here, what the fuck is that?
Goddamn ridiculous.
Well, I will say this kind of feeds into one of the criticisms that I have with how people label this film. I see this film turn up on a lot of people's lists of slashers, and
what?
I'm not gonna lie, I don't want to be gatekeepery when it comes to things like semantics, but to me, this has never been a slasher. Like, Pinhead is not a slasher villain. I don't like to see him equated with Michael Myers, you know, Freddy, all the others. It just, I'm like, no, these are a completely different type of film, at least the first couple.
Which makes you wonder to what degree, people who are saying that are retconning it based off of, like, part 3, where it starts to kind of get into that slasher realm. But even then, it's only kind of like wading into the slasher, kiddie pool a little bit.
But I think it's also because, I mean, I would have to talk to some of these people, but I wonder if these people just haven't actually watched the fucking movies, and they think, oh, it's Pinhead killing people, therefore slasher.
Yeah, maybe.
That's so weird to me. But everyone, if you have not seen a Hellraiser film and you did not watch Hellraiser 3 and 4 with us for our episodes, they are not slashers.
They're not slashers.
They don't fit the basic criteria of a slasher film.
Yeah, there's maybe one like moment in 3, like you could maybe argue that the club like massacre scene was kind of getting into that realm, and a little bit of like there's a little bit of like latter day Nightmare on Elm Street elements to when the new Cenobites show up. But yeah, even then, like it's still not a slasher movie, at least for me.
Well, why don't we move into what this film is, Joe? Let's start with your plot.
All right. Okay, so we start by zooming out of either the puzzle box or the lemon configuration, depending on what you want to call it. We are in a Moroccan market where Frank, played by Sean Chapman, is making what we can deduce is an illegal purchase.
Also, like, first red flag, no price.
Right?
Like, no, nothing is free. Come on, man.
Yeah, I will say the only thing that I really don't feel has aged well in this film is the not uncomfortable xenophobia of like, I went to a foreign market and I purchased this thing and oh Lord, it brought hell upon me.
It's capital E exotic.
Yeah.
I wasn't even thinking about that because all I could think about was one of them had the dirtiest fingernails I've ever seen on a human being in my life.
No, that was Frank.
That's
and
Frank.
I noticed that every goddamn time. It's so gross. It's the grossest. Like, dude, like, I know you are on like this obsessive quest for the ultimate sexual experience. Cut your fucking nails or at least clean them because that's gross.
They're black, solid.
So gross. Yeah. This is where I'm going to bring in my one and only source for this episode because I feel like the rest of us can do the heavy lifting with a lot of the other stuff. But I'm going to refer to Mark Richard Adams' chapter in Clive Barker, Dark Imaginer. And his chapter is called Clive Barker's Queer Monsters, Exploring Transgression, Sexuality, and the Other. And he really focuses on Frank, which is one of the reasons why I said this whole movie is just filled with queer characters, because Richard Adams spends his entire article talking about Frank as a queer othered figure. So, kicking things off here, he says, when Frank is first introduced, his body is coded as hypermasculine. He dresses in tight denim trousers and a clinging white vest, accentuating his body, and his unshaven face completes the image of a sexualized 1980s male. And I will say, if you didn't know that Clive Barker was gay, the way he shoots Frank throughout this film is like, you know that Clive Barker has a type, and it looks like Sean Chapman.
Admittedly, I've never like gone into a deep thought process with this film in the previous times I've watched it until now. I've never really thought about Frank as a queer figure, but now I'm going back into thinking, I wonder if, like, whenever we find the pictures later, they're only with women, but I wonder if there was ever, like, an inkling of Barker's that he's like, let me get one with a man in there, that
maybe
what wasn't allowed to be in the movie.
Well, rest assured, I will bring in many, many more quotes from Richard Adams that may help to convince you.
But you don't need to. I mean, I'm open to it. I just never thought about it. So, but by all means,
I think it's because people look at the film kind of like what you said. Like, you've got Pinhead on the cover. When we think of Hellraiser, we think of the Cenobites because they're so visually memorable. But yeah, there's a lot lurking beneath the surface of the human characters in this film as well.
Well, and bear in mind, I believe the ratio. So we have a 93-minute movie, which, God bless. And the Cenobites are on screen for 8 of those minutes. Like, this is a real Hannibal Lecter situation.
They are a memorable 8 minutes, however.
Oh,
there
yeah. Very much so.
Okay, so we follow Frank back to a dark, sweaty room, and he begins to solve the puzzle box, and we see lights begin to appear in the slats of the wall, and really before he can even begin to understand what's happening, we see hooks pierce his flesh, and he screams.
Immediately, by the way, these effects look so good.
So fucking good. And, like, combination with the score, the way Barker is shooting, it feels... I'm so intrigued. I have no idea what's about to happen, but the visual possibilities are tantalizing.
And even still, again, I'm going back to that review that was complaining about all the close-ups, but I think that, again, I mean, I guess it's cliche to say, close-up instills claustrophobia, but since we are spending the majority of this film in this cramped house, that all seems very intentional to me. And
Trace, just going back to talking about how much was probably cut out of that initial sequence and you talking about how it's actually more effective this way, I 100% agree. Because at this point, this whole thing's a tease. You're not supposed to know exactly what's going on.
Right.
So I feel like if they had dived too much into like all the gory glory of what that scene might have been originally, I think it takes a little something away because you get just enough to see like, oh man, he got real fucked up. His face is not on his body anymore. Like, I want to see more. And they're like, you're going to have to wait a little bit.
I think the first time I saw this was probably in high school. This is probably when I was like, finally allowed to watch R-rated movies. I was like Netflixing all those, like, your iconic horror films.
Right.
And I just remember being so confused as to why anyone would want to open this puzzle box because my mind, like, I heard the lines about distinguishing between pain and pleasure, but my knowledge of S&M was very minimal. So I was not tuned into what this movie was trying to say with those themes.
And that's hilarious, Trace. So one of the things that Brian and I spend a lot of time talking about, both on that limited series pod, but also when we covered all the Hellraiser films for Corpse Club, was the idea that this isn't about hell. This is about the tension between pain and pleasure. Like, there's something to be said for people saying, oh yeah, Barker infused his S&M sensibilities and even his queer lifestyle with like sadomasochism and blah, blah, blah. They misread that as, the only thing you would get out of this is the hell. Like, you would be torn apart, it would be super painful. And it's like, no, the whole point is that there's some kind of pleasure in there as well. Like, these aren't avenging angels or like demons who are here just to hurt you. They're here to deliver a promise that you said you wanted when you opened that box.
And also, I mean, look, because obviously a big conversation point in any discussion of S&M is going to be consent. And while many people, after they open the box, they're like, no. Technically solving that box is you giving consent.
Yes.
Which, obviously this is a horror movie, so they're playing in a gray area when it comes to that. There's something there pushing the narrative, but I've talked about this a few times where they call it Hellraiser, and he called the novella Hellbound Heart, but I think hell here is just more of shorthand to be able to say, like, going to a real bad place.
Yeah.
This isn't like a punitive thing. You're not going to Dante's Inferno where you're going to a certain level based off of what you've done in life. You're going there because essentially you asked for it. And one of the things that, and this might just be completely headcanon for me, but one of the other things I say about this a lot is I do like to imagine there are some people who have opened that box and really enjoyed what they got when they opened it. It just, Frank was not that person, because he is at heart, for me, like a vanilla square who thinks he's edgy and sexy.
But that's also, though, where again, I know this isn't really labeled as cosmic horror, but I do think it fits that bill. Again, if we're not going to say it's hell, I think that it puts it even more into cosmic horror territory.
Mm-hmm. I absolutely love this as cosmic horror. And I think it's also interesting because it's cosmic horror where you're used to the consequences of it being like insanity. And you don't really get that here. You get Frank obviously doesn't want to be there, and he has a lot of physical effects that come from that, but he never loses his mind. He doesn't go insane, and nobody, we'll talk later about Christy, a lot of people in that situation, I think, would just check out mentally, and she doesn't. And I think that's an important part of this story.
Well, okay, but
we'll get there.
We'll get back to it later. Yeah, but no, her first reaction after seeing Frank is very, very. She just goes catatonic in the street, and I was like, that is a real reaction.
Yep. But I do think it's important, Brian, to build on your statement that it's like this isn't about insanity in that way, and I think I've heard people, and we talked about this, Trace, when we covered Event Horizon on the Patreon for our audio commentary earlier this summer.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of people say, oh, that's Hellraiser in space. And I'm just like, kinda. But for me, that's like, oh, we found hell accidentally by teleporting this ship. Whereas Hellraiser, to me, it's far more complicated and nuanced because you have to always factor in the pleasure principle.
But also you're thinking to yourself, no, fuckers, Hellraiser 4 is Hellraiser in space.
There's also that.
Yeah, we already have Hellraiser in space. What the hell's wrong with you?
I will say, and I love the look of his face as like puzzle pieces. I do have an issue with the fact that his eyes are still there because that doesn't make any sense.
Right.
But it looks really cool.
It does, yeah. So this is also our visual introduction to female Cenobite, played by Grace Kirby, and the one and only Pinhead, played by Doug Bradley. I love that neither of these characters have any dialogue. We have no idea who they are, what they're doing here, and then it's just a snap. Pinhead solves this box, and the whole room is clean, spick and span. And this movie is fucking off to the races.
I do want to say, though, so Pinhead actually has some, like, the origins of this character, which I think in the novella he's just called, like, the lead Cenobite. Like, I don't think he goes by Pinhead until the second one, and even then it was a construct of people, like viewers, calling him Pinhead.
It was fans. He's often referred to as the High Priest, but he's actually not even the lead in the novella. It would be the female Cenobite who is.
Gotcha. Oh, well.
Put that in your back pocket.
I know, put it in your back pocket. But no, so he's combined from characters in Clive's early plays and images from some of his early short films. I won't go into them all, but the first identifiable stop on the journey is a character written by a then 21-year-old Clive Barker and played by a 19-year-old Doug Bradley. Back in 1973, it was a musical called Hunters in the Snow that Barker wrote in a musical staged at Liverpool's Everyman Theatre. But this story is of great artists as outsiders with werewolves and an undead inquisitor named the Dutchman. And this was the character that was played by Bradley.
Okay.
The Dutchman was tasked by the church with unmasking, torturing, and destroying the unclean and non-believers. And one of his lines, a sample line of this: "Why do you murmur? Why do you dread the calm symmetry of death? Is there not succor to be drawn from oblivion? The patterns must be complete. Birth is but the first preparation for death." So, does that not reek of Pinhead to you?
Oh my God. I just love Barker's prose so much. Like, I could imagine some people saying, like, it's a lot of purple prose. He's just too flowery with it. But I just think there's something so I don't know, maybe it's like the appropriate amount of melodrama to me, but it sings. It sounds like modern Shakespeare to me.
Well, it's I admittedly I've never read one of his novels before, so I don't know how it plays over like feature length for whatever maybe you call it for a book.
Novel
But
length?
I would say that for the novella for this, and I've read like his books of blood, like it works very well in short bursts in those like 30-page short stories.
Yeah.
And it's also one of those things where if you want to see like the difference between Clive Barker's ability to, create a phrase and to work prose and someone trying to do that and it not really working the same way, watch this and then watch Bloodline. And then you'll see like when people take what they think is like a Barker-esque way to talk and instead turn Pinhead into a Bond villain.
Right.
Yeah, that's very correct. That's a very correct assumption.
Oh boy. Okay, so after the room has been cleaned, we glide down the stairs to the front door, and this to me is like masterful camera work in terms of showing us the geography of this house and giving us the setting. Because as you said, Trace, the whole movie almost entirely takes place in this house. It is a character unto itself, so it's really important that we get a feel for it.
And I mean, again, this house is tiny. It's like we have this like living space right here, and then the dining room, and then just whatever the upstairs is, which is just those 3 rooms.
Yep.
One thing I've never really seen that I would be interested to know is like where they got their hands on the house. Like, was it somebody in the crew? Like, this is my house, you can use it? Was it they scouted and they found something that, I would imagine wasn't occupied at the time or something like that? Like, I've never really seen, like, how did they come upon this house? Because it was perfect for what they needed.
Yeah. Okay, so we are introduced to Larry, who is played by Andrew Robinson, and his uncertain wife, Julia, the one and only Claire Higgins.
Okay, wait, Joe, get it out. Why do you love this character?
Oh my god, how much time do you have?
And then
Just
make
another
sure
episode.
you leave double that amount of time for when I come in and also talk about why I love her.
So, as I said, this was like my big foray into horror films, and the film not only showed me that horror films could be infused with other genres, so as I said, I consider this more of a melodrama with horrific elements, but I was fascinated with how people confuse who the villain of the film is, because the villain of this film is fucking Julia, but she's also incredibly, I don't want to say sympathetic because she makes some really fucking bad choices, but she's also so fucking fascinating. Like, I love her arc and her journey. I love the fact that she ends up becoming an evil stepmother in this film, but really into the second film. And I don't know, I just think Claire Higgins' performance is fucking masterful. She commands the screen in every inch of the frame that she's taking up space in. And I don't know, like, there's something about her that really pops. And I feel like, particularly when we talk about villains, we never talk about her. But even when we talk about female villains, she always gets forgotten.
Well, and it's also, I'm glad you even said arc, because I in the back of my mind, I always remember her as being hissably evil from minute 1, and that is not the case here. Like, and you can see this in Claire Higgins' performance, like, as she struggles with, do I want to do this, do I not want to do this? And of course, she ultimately chooses to, but it is believable for the most part, from beginning to end.
Yeah, I mean, girl, she goes further than maybe you should, and we can get our yayas out and say, like, man, how good was that dick that she would do all this? Like, okay, we've said it all before, and it's a great joke, but also that's underselling what this character is actually delivering.
I mean, this is an unabashed woman villain, and it's not something that's based in pain or the service to somebody else. Yes, again, you could make that argument that she's doing this for Frank. But for me, the importance of her arc is that you're realizing that she's not doing it for Frank. She's doing it for the possibilities of what it could mean for herself.
Yes.
Right.
And it's selfish and it's awful.
Yeah.
And she's an awful person, and I will forever love her for it.
Right?
Well, let me pull in then this quote from Barker, because this kind of encapsulates what he was trying to do, or what appealed to him so much about this story. So he says, "We all have an affinity for monsters to some extent. The moment when Karloff smokes a cigar and listens to the blind man play the violin in Bride of Frankenstein, or the look of tenderness that crosses King Kong's face when he realizes that Fay Wray is too precious to kill. Too often, those moments aren't allowed to be talked about by the monster, who is either mute or grunts.
Mm-hmm.
I want to give monsters the freedom to talk about themselves. I like hugely the clarity of debate, where Frank can say to Julia, we belong to each other now for better or worse, like love, only for real. That's a monster's viewpoint, a monster's idea of what love is. It's purer than if they'd gone up the aisle together. One of the things I tried to do in this picture is to lose any real sense of who constitutes the really good and the bad, not unlike the Cenobites themselves. It's not as simple as monsters representing all the bad stuff in our lives. We have very ambivalent responses to them. They can be very attractive. We may even envy them. Think of the powers of classical monsters, powers of flight, transformation, infinite sexual allure, the ability to evade death. These powers are not negligible, nor are they all negative. I'd pay a little for a few of those.
And the weird thing to me, too, is I've read academics who have accused this film of presenting otherness, and i.e. queerness, as negative. Like, they say, oh, Frank is a deviant, and he's a terrible villain. Julia is an adulteress, and therefore she's terrible. And then, of course, the Cenobites are fucking terrifying. And I'm just like, how do you not see the layers of this? And like, these monsters are so intriguing. They're so just messy and weird, and I feel like they represent this broad spectrum, and to put them into a little box is misreading the film, in my opinion.
But I also think, again, like we talk about this so many times with things like this, where it's removing any nuance from the scenario. And I do think a part of it is because, again, I think people see them a little bit of themselves in either Frank or Julia or both. And I think they're afraid to come to terms with those feelings because, again, it is evil. Society says these are evil, and they are evil. And we are afraid to admit that we sometimes have evil tendencies.
Yeah, this movie is all about embracing that dark corner of yourself. And I think it's a little bit of a precursor, too, to what you're going to see explored more in Nightbreed, where Barker is taking these classic monsters, or people you would classically think of as monsters and villains, and showing you that like monster doesn't have to equate to villain. And I think he's a lot more severe in this movie, and he's making the monsters and the villains much less sympathetic, but he's also kind of daring you to see yourself in everybody in this movie, right. be it Kirsty, be it the Cenobites, be it Frank, or be it Julia.
Well, and the thing with Julia, even, I mean, she fucks Frank, like before her wedding. So it's kind of like one of those things where it's like, why did you go through with this? But honestly, again, and I'm not like sympathizing with this character because she does she makes a horrible decision. She betrays the man she's about to marry. Doesn't just fucking call off the wedding because it's inconvenient for her, I guess. Like, we don't really know why this happens. But at the same time, I feel bad for her because, yeah, she does seem trapped. And maybe that's bad because it's like she has a good life with Larry. But Larry's also, for lack of a better term, boring.
Oh my god, he's the ultimate in boring, and that's what's so great about Andrew Robinson's performance.
Yeah, but again, I don't dislike Larry as a character. He's fine. But again, when you have the taste of what Frank has given her, which is sensual seduction, which is not what she's getting from Larry. I mean, again, it also mirrors what's going on with this box and what Frank is trying to get, because he's been desensitized to all these things because he's experienced most of the pleasures of the flesh except for this extremity.
Yeah, and I feel like that's the piece that we don't really know about Julia, but I feel like it's also relatively easy to suss out, right? She was happy with Larry until Frank came along.
Yes.
But then Frank leaves, so she's got nothing else, and she's trying to recapture... I think she's trying to get comfortable with complacency and normality again, but the problem is that, like Frank, once you've tasted that danger and that level of sensuality, someone who's as milquetoast as Larry is never going to cut it.
Well, it's... Hey, the one thing I love about Higgins' performance is actually in the flashbacks when we see her first hook up with Frank.
She's so simple and vulnerable.
But she's smiling. She is genuinely happy. And we never see that again outside of this flashback.
No. And that's when she becomes the Ice Princess.
I think there is one moment where you see her truly happy, but we'll come back to that.
Oh, no, but again, I compare things to drugs so many times. But yeah, it's like, that whole thing about if you ever have sex when you're on ecstasy, like you're never going to want to have sex again because it's going to be so good, you'll never have sex that good again. That's what this was with her and Frank. She's constantly chasing that high, and she cannot get it without Frank.
Well, and that's why I think, I admonish people for reducing this down to how good was the dick joke. But the reality is like, yeah, she experienced something, and now she she wants to get back to that. It's more than just the dick. It's the mystery. It's the bad boy-ness of it all. It's, I think, even breaking her out of this constrained heteronormativity. Like, sure, bed down with Larry. He's boring, but he'll be safe. And she's like, or I could go after this dangerous thing. And my life could be completely unpredictable and wild. But isn't that better? Isn't that more exciting?
And that's the thing. She's not going after Frank. She's going after, as you
chasing
said, this
that.
dangerous thing.
Yeah, she's chasing the high, as you said, Trace.
And the moments where you see her, where you see like that stone cold face kind of, crack, and you see that smile come back, there's two moments where that happens. The first is the one that, of course, Joe, you and I both love, where she's killed her first guy with a hammer. And she's in just a bra. She's splashed with blood.
Yes.
You see her kind of like start looking into the mirror, and you just see just the slightest upturn on the sides of her mouth.
Yep. She's horrified at what she's done, but she's also like, I kind of liked it. And the way Barker frames it, you're so in her face. You are inches away from her. You're seeing every little detail because it is such a slight little smile.
But there is a difference, though, between the smile we get in the flashback and that smile, because there's a confidence in that smile that was not there before.
Yeah, because she's starting to revel in her power, right? Like, I routinely refer to Julia Cotton as the baddest bitch in horror because you can see that in the arc. Like, she is transcending into an absolutely horrific person, but you get to watch her learn to like it.
Well, also, I would argue that Julia is the protagonist of this film.
She 100% is. She gets so much screen time.
I know Kirsty comes into it, she's our final girl, but like the protagonist of this movie is still Julia.
Correct.
And it's, and like the second moment that you get where Julia is truly happy is during the montage of when she's just, at this point, she's comfortable with it and she's just knocking these putzes over left and right. You get that shot of her just sitting by herself in the living room.
Drinking.
Just perfectly content. And she's not with Larry. She's not with Frank. She's by herself. And she just could not be happier. And that, I think, is just like, good for you, Julia. That's amazing. I love that for you.
Well, and she also looks fucking amazing.
Yeah, dressed to the nines to sit in her house.
Yeah, she looks almost feline in her like sexual energy and confidence, and you're just like, oh, she's dangerous and bad, and it's like, I'm really turned on right now.
And I wonder too, like, because we don't get a kind of backstory for Julia outside of just her relationship with Frank, so we don't know if there was a reason why she feels so lonely and blah blah blah. And I'm glad that we don't get that, but I also think that the reason people are so immediately like lumping Julia into this, oh, she's an evil cunt box, which again she is, but there's just more to it than that. As you said, Brian, she's just looking out for her own happiness, and granted she is doing it in very selfish ways, but these are not things that I'll speak for myself, I am foreign to. I mean, have I wanted to fuck someone ever so I could better myself? Yes. Right. Have I done it? Sometimes yes, sometimes no. And I am I mean, I've never done it like this, but again, I'm comfortable admitting that and saying I've made bad choices in my life, and I feel like some people are just afraid to say either they have made those choices or that they have thought about making those choices.
Trace, have you ever made those choices and then like sat in your living room with a martini just smiling to yourself about it?
I'm going to now, actually.
Yeah.
My God.
After this recording, when I fuck all over.
I was going to say, like, this is when we feel at our peak, when we have achieved what we are truly wanting and desiring and we feel satisfied. It's like, just sit like Julia Cotton on your couch and just savor a drink. Okay, so it's been 10 years since the pair has been in this house, and he wants to move in here, and he even says things like, we could be happy here, and she just kind of looks at him like, you've got to be fucking kidding me. Like,
and he says,
boring.
You're on your home turf. Okay, where exactly is your home turf?
Oh my God. This
where
is why
are you?
The US setting does not make any sense in this movie. You're like, no, this is the UK. So they begin to look around. She's very unimpressed with all of this, but then he gets a phone call from his adult daughter, Kirsty, played by also the one and only Ashley Lawrence.
I do like her. On this there's a documentary on this Blu-ray, and yeah, one of the men is like, if there's a wink link in the film, I do think it's Ashley Lawrence. I think the role is underwritten, and I do think that Lawrence is, like, this being her debut role, I don't think she's really able to give it her all. Like, she's fine, but it's not as good as everything else in the film that's going on. I'm actually inclined to disagree with that statement.
Yeah, I think she doesn't shine as much as everybody else does, but I don't think that's really her job in this movie.
Yeah.
Like she is, if there's anything missing to the performance, it's because of the role, because this isn't meant to be as meaty as Julia.
It's not her movie.
Yeah, exactly.
And she will get her movie next time.
Oh my God. And like, if you want to talk about growth and ascension, watching her face off against Julia in the Leviathan in part 2 is all the more satisfying because you're finally getting to see Kirsty's movie.
Well, also, Hellbound Hellraiser 2. Well, actually, no, both of these movies are so inherently feminine, right?
Yes.
Because this is very much Julia's movie, but that second movie, we get Julia and Kirsty's really front and center, and then the other girl. So it's only Chenard who's there as like the male figure in that sequel.
Yeah, and if you want to talk about the fucking weak link of that sequel, it's Dr. Chenard.
Disagree, but okay.
I mean, I like him. I think he's interesting, but also when he comes in, I'm like, yeah, but it was Julia versus Kirsty.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. Well, you know what? We will discuss Hellbound, the fourth of these 4 Hellraiser movies we've covered eventually.
I'm just saying, I'm angling to get as many of these motherfuckers in as we can.
Hey, we saved the best for last.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we'll hash out that battle as well when we talk about the second one. Okay, so Larry is trying to get Kirsty to come and live with them, and she is like, Dad, I'm an adult. Can you please let me live with... We'll find out more about Steve later. But...
Oh my God. Okay, I'm going to tell you right now, you cut Steve out of this movie, it's a 5-star film for me.
Steve doesn't make a lick of difference, but there are some great moments where he gets punched in the face.
Yes, I'm just like, I like their introductory scene when they first meet, when he's flirting with that cigarette in his mouth. Everything after that, I don't know why he's in this movie outside of we need a man to comfort Kirsty.
Well, I do enjoy the fact that in most movies, like I don't know if you've ever heard the term, like someone being a lamp. Usually it's when you're talking about how there's a woman in a movie and you could replace her with a lamp in that movie and it would make no difference to the plot. I like that Steve is the lamp in this movie. Like he
Absolutely.
does nothing. He like I would even argue when we get to the end, I would argue that like they reference that to a certain extent in the movie. Like they have a little metatextual conversation about that.
I kept thinking he was going to die in the climax. Every time I watch this movie, I'm like, oh, yeah, he dies in this scene. I don't remember that he survives. Nope, he survives.
He's not interesting enough to die in this movie.
That's so true. But as Larry is talking to Kirsty, we see Julia going through, basically, it's like a flop house kind of deal, right? Like Frank was squatting here. He's got a shitty mattress on the floor. He's got various drug paraphernalia. And then he's got lightly S&M photos with a variety of different women. And Julia picks up the hottest pinup photo and pockets it for later.
She got to finger herself later.
Basically, yeah. I mean... Sean Chapman, very, very attractive. I can see
very
the
sweaty.
appeal. I don't mind it. So, okay. So, cut to Sunday, just in case you didn't want to, delve into some of the religious connotations of this film. We're going to move in on a Sunday. Julia catches the attention of these sweaty movers. Must have been very hot when they were filming because everyone just has that nice glisten of like a sheen on them.
Oh, there's one point where Ashley Lawrence, it's like dripping off of her chin.
I think it's very, very hot. But I love the sort of subtle use of, okay, these are obviously gross movers that are helping to move Larry and Julia in, but also it's visually coding that Julia can pick up men, right? Like she will attract the attention of men very easily.
I also love to always think about how when Doug Bradley was like offered to be in this movie, he got 2 choices. Like you can either be this Cenobite or you can be one of the movers. And he legitimately considered being one of the movers so that his like natural face would show up in the movie.
Yeah. I mean, it's the Freddy Krueger challenge, right? Where it's like you're under so much prosthetics, no one will ever take you as your own actor. You will always just be the character. And I do feel bad for Doug Bradley. Like, he has lived in the shadow of Pinhead his entire career. But also on the flip side, what a fucking legacy.
Well, I mean, I don't know about you, but his true legacy for me is the villain in Wrong Turn 5.
Oh my God. We will cover Wrong Turn 5 someday as well. And we have a lot to talk about.
We're not doing 5.
Well, now you kind of have to because you brought up Doug Bradley being in it. So now
Oh
it's
my
kind
God.
of, you can't leave people hanging on that.
I mean, look, that franchise is not filled with any good apples except for like 2, but
it's no Hellraiser.
5 is definitely one of the worst.
Yeah, 5 is atrociously bad. Okay, so Kirsty ends up arriving on foot. We get a perspective from outside of the house for the first time, and we can see that it's a little bit run down. It's also isolated, and that will become important when we start to murder people in the attic. So, Larry and Kirsty decide that she is going to be nice to Julia, so we're setting up some gentle exposition about character relationships, but I love how organic it all feels, you know? It's very much, oh, daughter and stepmother do not get along well, so there's going to be a little bit of tension there.
Mm-hmm.
And meanwhile, Julia is upstairs basically having masturbatory flashback fantasies about the day that Frank arrived in the rain to ruin her fucking wedding.
I guess I didn't even think, do y'all think that, because this is intercut with Larry, you know, moving the piece of furniture upstairs. Do you think then that it's a nail that cuts his hand is intentional to be like the stigmata?
I wasn't seeing that so much as like necessarily the religious iconography, but more just the juxtaposition of like, again, the sexuality with the violence, you know, so she's approaching that climax either in the flashback or maybe on the 3rd floor of the house as she's thinking about it, you know, and they're thrusting that mattress and getting it closer and closer, you know, and then I guess you could say the nail does sort of penetrate Larry's hand. So it's, you know, I think that's kind of more the focus. Although there definitely was, Barker does talk about using some religious iconography just to kind of like sparse through. Like I think when they first get there, there's like some like nativity stuff while they're moving, things like that.
And then when Kirsty arrives, they're all like of the Mary Magdalene statues are out on the drive.
Oh my God. Yeah. Wait, Joe, I'm sorry. Mary and Mary Magdalene are 2 very different people.
Sure, both of those.
Mary Magdalene's the prostitute.
We don't say prostitute.
Well, back then they did. But Mary Magdalene's the sex worker. Mary is Mother of God. Mother of Jesus.
Yeah, the same thing.
Just Mary. Mary, no last name.
Yeah, because God forbid the prostitute were the son of God, or the mother of God, right?
The prostitute gets a last name.
Right. Important distinction. I'm with Brian. I like to think of this movie, I mean, it's not It Follows level of like, be careful who you engage with in terms of sexual conduct and activity, but I always looked at this as like, yeah, there's a bit of a body count and some bloodletting when you choose to engage in carnal activities. And I don't see it as a conservative approach to sexuality, but it's like violence and sexuality and otherness are all wrapped up in one and the same game in this movie.
It's like how we talk about horror and comedy. It's violence and sex.
Right. Complementary and contradictory.
I also like to think of it as her desire for Frank is part of what brings him back. You know,
right.
It's the coincidence of her lusting after him and thinking of him right when the mechanism or the catalyst for bringing him back happens. You know, I don't think is... it might be a coincidence in the movie, but I think thematically it's not a coincidence.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, especially if you think of this as her film and she is the person driving it, she has the agency, then it also kind of makes sense in that regard.
Yeah.
Just to reiterate that the focus on Frank is like highly sexualized. So when he is introduced in these flashbacks, he's introduced like in the rain. We barely see Julia in these scenes so that we can focus on the full body of Sean Chapman. And there's like this lingering emphasis of Frank as a spectacle that foreshadows the queer sexual identity that's going to be revealed when his body is literally deconstructed and then restructured. So we're very interested in Frank's body overall throughout the course of this movie.
We're about to get really acquainted with Frank's body.
Yeah, so we do get to see some aggressive sex in these flashbacks as well before Larry's hand gets cut. And obviously we talked about the MPAA rating, but I love just... No one can accuse Clive Barker of being sentimental or not being like, yeah, I'm going to be inflammatory, because I love the fact that they fuck on top of her wedding gown. It's like, oh, fuck your heteronormative wedding.
It shows how vanilla her sex life was, though, because when she lays down on this bed, she lays down like a fucking wooden plank, like arms at her side, like just flat on the ground. I'm thinking to myself, like I was like, when I lay down to fuck on a bed, what do I do? And I'm like kind of like leaning on my hands, kind of sitting up. I don't just fucking like lay back like I'm a vampire going into a coffin.
What feels virginal, right?
But then it only takes like one cut scene and then back, and she is just full blown into it. Like,
yeah, that's all it takes.
She goes from like virginal to fully realizing her sexuality, like in a split second.
Okay. So yes, Larry does cut his hand. He comes in, we get blood on the floor, and they have to take him to the hospital for stitches. We stick around so that we can watch one of my favorite practical effects sequences in all of horror history.
So good.
It's so weird. I forget this scene every time, and I don't know how. And I'll probably never do it again. I know. No, watching this last night, I mean, this is like I want to say 90 seconds. Like, this is a long sequence. Mm-hmm. I was just watching this with jaw on the floor, like, holy shit, this looks so good.
It's so good. And then you think about, okay, they didn't even have £1 million budget to do this. Like, I don't know how this sequence alone didn't cost them nearly every penny that they had. Sorry, not a penny in a pound. Ugh.
Every shekel.
What's a small amount in British dollars? Yeah. It looks so good. And watching, my favorite part is when the skeleton lurches forward so that it can connect to the brain.
Yes. Oh. Yeah. It is gross. This is a gross sequence, but
yes.
Honestly, with that budget, I'm just like, just looking at Blumhouse, I'm like, y'all, you can do it.
We believe in you, Blumhouse.
We believe in you.
And I think you could probably say borrowed heavily by Nightmare on Elm Street 4, the Dream Master in Freddy's resurrection scene, a year later?
Yeah.
Because they do a lot of that, reverse filming, reverse melting to kind of, go from destroyed to piece back together again.
I wonder, do you think maybe there was, I don't know how widely available it would have been, but it had been out for years, but the effects of Evil Dead were any influence on this?
Mm.
I mean, I'd like to think that people who are working in the biz are keeping track of what their contemporaries are doing, right? Like, I think of American Werewolf in London and The Howling and how they were both sort of like keeping an eye on how they were doing the respective werewolf transformations. So I don't know if makeup and FX artists are like, oh, how did you do it? Oh, I like that. I'm going to steal that piece.
Yeah, well, yeah. Who knows?
Okay, so we get this amazing sequence, and then it's just like, back to reality. Let's have a dinner party now that we're moved in. So unfortunately, this is where we're introduced to Steve, who is played by Robert Hines. He and Kirsty are very cute together as they're making fuck eyes at the table.
Constantly.
And Julia is not into this at all. Like, the honeymoon is over already. So she gets up claiming that she's got a headache. And as she proceeds upstairs, she hears sounds in the attic. And this is where she finds the skinless body of Frank, now played by Oliver Smith, who asks her to help him heal.
This scene is terrifying. Like, I'm sorry. And it plays, Higgins plays it so well, because I'm going to tell you right now, I
be fucking shitting your pants.
Like, I am surprised she did not diarrhea all over her feet. Like, this is ridiculous.
Now I'm just picturing the practical effects for that.
Oh my god. It's a whole other budget. The thing that I love is how she almost gets out. Like, there's a lot of people opening doors and then the door getting pushed shut. It's not like, oh, I'm grappling with the door handle and I can't get it open. It's like people always nearly get out of situations and then the monster locks them back in.
And he is so wet.
Oh my God, is so wet.
Like, the close-ups on this, like, it's not even a body because he can't even stand up. It's like a husk of a human that is just grayish green and wet all over.
I don't even think he has legs yet. Or not fully formed legs, yeah.
I think he's like dragging them, right?
Well, because the first time she brings the first victim home, I was like, God, Frank is taking a long time to come out and kill this guy, but because he cannot stand up.
No. and that's an interesting piece. So coming back to Mark Richard Adams, he says there's no visible signs of the past gender or strength. Like, there's no machismo that we've seen in Frank of either the opening sequence of the flashbacks. And he's actually forced to rely on Julia as a kind of mother, right? And I think that's part of the reason why people also see her as the wicked stepmother. Like, she is having to take on these more maternal roles when it comes to nurturing Frank, feeding him blood, bringing him men, and so on. But this is also interesting how we do get to watch Frank's gender and identity throughout each stage of his reconstruction. So it's like we're seeing these new colors and designs and layers as he progresses through the film. So we get to watch his sort of like othered body evolve.
And it is funny watching him kind of play the petulant child. You know, he doesn't like being in this dependent position or this submissive position. You know, he's the top. And that's how he likes it. And so that's why he doesn't like what he finds with the Cenobites, and that's why he is very, very cranky. I mean, he's understandably cranky because he's half a person with no skin. Right. But at the same time, it's more to it than that. You know, he doesn't like having to depend on Julia because she's another line of women who are less than, or, you know, who don't really matter. And so now he has to depend on her, and he doesn't like it.
It's the woman that you kick to the curb because she wasn't enough, because it's never enough, according to Frank. And all of a sudden now he's got to be like, oh, fuck, that chick that I fucked the one time and then kicked to the curb, I've got to depend on her.
Like, he just got his car repossessed, and she's the only person, like, he knows with a car, and he's got to get to work. So it's like, now I'm dependent on you. So
can you drive me around?
Like, I can't just tell you to fuck off anymore.
Yeah.
I do love, so I do, the whole thing with him saying, oh, don't look at me, don't look at me. I feel like that's a budgetary thing, so we don't have to see what he's doing. The only thing is, I don't fully believe he would care, because I feel like this could be playing into more of his, like, sex games.
Oh, see, no, I'm inclined to agree with Bryan. I see it as an insecurity because he knows his power when he's at his full capacity, like when he's beautiful and human. But here he's like, oh, look at me, I'm a husk of a man. Like, it's also a bit of an interesting commentary on disability, right? Where it's like he used to think of himself one way, and then something's happened, and now he doesn't see himself that way anymore, and he doesn't know how to handle it.
I guess you're probably right. The only thing, I feel like someone that well versed in bondage and sadomasochism would have a more clear understanding of, like, the power structure and more operating on both sides of it.
See, here's my thing. I don't think he has a very good grasp on the dynamics of kink.
No,
because I don't think he knew what he was getting into when it came to the Cenobites, and I think his idea of, like really hot subversive sex wouldn't go beyond like reality kings or brazzers if he was online. So like when he actually was introduced to really boundary pushing sex, or in this case, getting his body ripped apart, you know, again, we're talking in horror movie metaphors here, he couldn't handle it. So I don't think he's capable of sex play or sex games, like whatever he's coming back from, he's not up to that challenge at all.
But at the same time, I don't think anyone who opens this puzzle box fully understands what they are getting into.
Oh, sure. Yeah, I mean, that's half the fun.
And like I said, the idea that I like to think that some people opened it and got exactly what they wanted, that's fully headcanon. I don't know that there's anything within the text that suggests that there's anybody who likes what they get when they open this. But I don't know. I hate Frank. I just hate him so much. Like, I hate him in the movie. I hate him in the book. He is just that guy who likes to wave his dick around and likes to think he's this experienced, explorer of sexual experience. And he's just he's a predator. Like, there's nothing interesting about the kind of sex he wants to have.
He cares about no one but himself. And again, I think that's what makes Julia such a more interesting character, is because there are parts of where you can be like, I get why you're doing this. But with Frank, we don't have that insight.
No, honestly, I think of Amy from Brooklyn Nine-Nine, and it's like, Frank, yeah, basic. Like,
I love that you just made that connection.
Well, when you think of the pictures that Julia finds that she covets, right? They're supposed to be daring and risque and stuff. And you look at it and you're like, A, is it just because he's having sex with a woman of color in a couple of them? Because ew. But also, like, this is the lightest. Like, this is vanilla BDSM. So I don't know if this is a 1987 censorship thing. Like, we don't want to push the envelope too much. But I always read it as, no, Frank, Yeah, basic.
His idea of kink is whipping out a switchblade for a couple of seconds and
Right.
maybe some light hair pulling.
Right. Yes. And maybe spanking in a deleted scene.
Yes.
Okay, so she's like, okay, can I get out of this room? So she leaves, and we get this interesting, threatening moment, and I love the way this is shot, where Julia and Kirsty have, like, just a very tense encounter, because Kirsty wants to go upstairs, and Julia's like, no, I'm not letting you, and this is where you start to see the frostiness really creeping into Julia.
Which you love to see.
Okay, so we follow Kirsty home for a little bit, she and Steve, and she notices that the derelict, who is played by Frank Baker, is eyeing her. That's kind of a simmering B-plot. We'll come back to it later.
Yeah.
And that night, we get both Julia and Frank reflecting on her promise to do anything for him, and she ultimately decides to help him out.
I would have been satisfied with just she loves him so much or whatever the fuck, but that we cut back to that line of her saying, I'll do anything for you. And I'm like, bitch, you could have made an exception this one time.
Yeah, when you said that, you probably didn't imagine you'd be delivering John Doe's to him. I do love also that this scene immediately transitions over to Kirsty's nightmare. This is one of the only dream sequences that we get in a fantastical film, but I think that the placement of it is important. You could easily look at this scene and say, like, it's some interesting visual imagery, but what's the point of it? And I kind of think of it in the same way, Brian, that you mentioned Julia almost manifests Frank back from the grave. This feels like the beginning of Kirsty's telepathic connection to Frank, and I always look at them as mirrors in this movie. So Frank has gotten Julia onto his side, the evil plans are in the works, and Kirsty immediately feels, oh, my father is in danger, and that's why she makes the phone call to him in the middle of the night. There's nothing to support any of that in the text. That's just how I look at it.
There's also nothing to contradict it.
There we go. Yes.
We're counting it.
All right, so the next day, Julia dons a power bitch outfit and she heads to the bar.
The shoulder pads on this thing.
So good. I mean, it is the 80s, but she looks fucking amazing.
And is this the one where she's got the star earrings on too? I know at some point there's some like really top notch, just like in your face star shaped earrings that are just exquisite.
I mean, look, listeners, y'all know I don't pay attention to costumes that much. So for me to even make a note of the shoulder pads, that's how stand out they are.
They are striking. Her outfits from the rest of the film on are just so impressive. But also you could argue that they are sort of towing the line between like feminine and masculine. Like there's a hardness to her look, even like her sort of David Bowie androgynous haircut, and
a lot of
it's
pantsuits.
80s, but it's also very apropos that she is sort of straddling the gender line.
Yeah, I was gonna say, she doesn't get naked in this film, but we do get a flash of her boob during that sex scene, which I did forget to point out. If you pause it just right,
oh my God,
you can see Frank's penis when he gets up from that bed.
What?
Yeah, no, it's not like because you see him on the bed naked with his legs crossed, but then he stands up, and once he stands up and starts walking out of frame, you can see his dick.
I mean, I never really even saw it as you need to pause it. Like, I'm pretty sure there's just a quick flash of he hangs dong a little bit.
Yeah.
Tatum, just get in the car. Okay, so she brings this man, who is played by Anthony Allen, back to the house. She hits him in the face 3 times, and then she leaves Frank to do his dirty work.
The frame, I love the shots of her whenever, like, it's when she first picks up the hammer and like gets ready to strike it. It looks like a publicity still almost, where it's just her with this ray of light shining on her as she just looks ready to kill. It is such a good shot, and she looks fantastic.
It's his first movie. He doesn't know what he's doing.
Yeah,
sure,
literally
he's
doesn't know what he's doing.
I just like every shot of this movie to me is gorgeous. Like I would frame stills from this movie by the dozens.
Actually, Joe, it's a bankruptcy of imagination.
Both spot on Ebert impressions, by the way.
Oh my God. Well, now we're going to hell.
No.
So she basically leaves so that she can clean herself up. This is when we get the shot that you were talking about, Brian, that's so great. And then she goes back in to check on the progress, and Frank is like, hey, look at this. I can start to feel things and all this shit. And you're just like, oh my God, Frank. I love how it's all about you. all the time.
Yeah, like it's literally like, again, like the pinnacle of sexual experience for him is like, I want to touch your boob.
Mm-hmm.
Like that's what he's bringing to the table.
My God, I'm gonna tell you right now too. I don't know if y'all do this, but I cringe every time because I'm just like, he is so gooey.
Yeah.
Like he's literally dripping with goo. Like it's not just he's like a sheen. No, he's dripping with this stuff. Oh, blah, blah, blah.
But at that point, that's the only interesting thing about him at that point.
his wet status is the only interesting thing about him.
My goo, not my goo.
God. I do love to, yeah, like she leaves this room so that she can go and clean herself up. Admittedly not super, super well, but she's probably also in a little bit of shock because she's just helped to commit her first murder. The first thing he wants to do is grab her wrist and hurt her, and then she's like, well, I guess I'll stick your finger in my mouth.
Blah.
But then also he's like, oh, can you get rid of this corpse now that Larry's back? Because we need to move it into a different room. Like, the laborer.
Dude, like, I thought you were gonna, like, literally just absorb this. I gotta clean this shit up? Are you serious?
Yeah, again, she's got a kid now. Like,
yeah.
She's got to feed him. She's got to clean up after him.
Exactly.
And then he grabs her by the tit. Like, this is not...
It's not good.
This is not a good situation.
So I'm going to turn back to Mark Richard Adams at this point, because in case people haven't been paying attention, we will see multiple people get murdered by Frank in this film. They are all men. And sure, it's because Julia can attract men and bring them back to the house, but...
Okay.
So the fact that Frank and Julia's primary victims are male has a certain queer connotation. His victims consist entirely of men, including his own brother, in one of two potential acts of incest within the film, suggesting a repressed queer desire on Frank's part. He does love to stick his fingers into men.
Okay, it was because it sounded like you said that the incest would hint at repressed queer desire. So are we linking incest? I guess if we're saying incest is like literally queer, but not queer?
I think in this case, just because his brother is a man, but
yeah.
Mark Richard Adams, I think, is suggesting more in the pantheon of victims, like they're all men, and Frank doesn't seem to have an issue sticking his fingers in, sucking the juices out of them. Obviously, he does it to Julia at the end of the film as well, so he's a bit of an equal opportunist, but... Yeah, I mean, I think part of it is we're positioning Frank on a deviant sexuality spectrum because he's not afraid to be incestual and he's not afraid to go after men.
God, I mean, it's that conflation of incest with queerness. That it's a bit of a weird connection for me, but pulling it back a bit, I get it. I can't believe I've never thought about this. He's sticking his fingers in men and sucking their juices, and I never thought about the queer reading.
And it gives another layer to when he says, don't look at me, when he's doing that.
Yeah, ooh, don't look at my shame.
Oh my God, but we do love some queer shame on this podcast.
That comes up a lot, yeah. Important to note too, like there's a lot of linkages, like characters are often sort of shadow or mirror reflections of one another, so I suggested that I think Frank and Kirsty are. Obviously, the brothers are as well, so one of the most infamous lines that Frank is always delivering is, "Come to Daddy." And when Larry arrives home and he finds Julia she's pretending to be sick so that she can get him to go away, he says, "You want anything, little girl?" And you're just like, gross. Oh, so both brothers are actually sort of like gentle misogynists.
But then we go from all this to this, to a glimpse into Kirsty's work life at the pet store with this old biddy who is really upset about something involving her bird, but we will never know what that is.
I want to speak to your manager.
You have to wait.
I'm sorry, there's a man eating live crickets over to the side. I think your bird can wait.
And actually, I just would have pointed him out, and then, like, I'm guessing the woman leaves if you point out the man eating crickets.
I mean, she's British. She's probably properly scandalized when she sees what's going on over there. She's like, I'll just come back. So, yes, we get a second murder, and then this is when Julia demands exposition. Oh, sorry, when she demands an explanation about what happened.
Little Freudian slip there.
And we do get another flashback to Frank being... Basically, he's hung upside down, similar to what we see in Hostel Part 2, and he's being tortured, but... Again, these scenes are very brief, and I think it's just to really illuminate there is that tension between what he was looking for and what they're delivering unto him. And I don't know. I can understand why people would look at this and say, oh, well, he's being tortured, hence torture porn. But I just think that is simplifying it.
I mean, so for me, I do think they are, quote unquote, just torturing him. But again, there is no distinction between pleasure and pain. They are one and the same.
Right.
It just so happens that their version of pleasure is our version of pain.
Oh, okay. I like it.
And I still think there's a level of eroticism to the way they're doing it. He's upside down. He's got no shirt on. He's probably naked, but you only see him from the torso down, or up, I guess in this case. And he's moaning. It's not orgasmically by any means, but
right.
yeah, there definitely is still some, I think, erotic undertones to what you're seeing. Perhaps a little bit muted by the fact that, like, I keep thinking about how poor Sean Chapman, the guy who plays Frank, talked about how he got like very nauseous in that scene because he's just got spinning. Like fake blood dumping into his mouth while he's just repeatedly spinning around. And as someone who gets like motion sick pretty bad, that like is like, oh man, I feel you, buddy. That must not have been pleasant.
But it's true, right? I mean, if you had the sound up but you weren't watching the screen, you could mistake this for S&M porn because it's moaning and the sounds of like chains and stuff. You're like, okay, there's a bit of dungeon action going on. Cool. Okay. So we cut to a stormy night, and we've got Larry and Julia watching the big fight. All of a sudden, she doesn't seem so bothered by all the blood and violence on screen. Frank, on the other hand, is acting like a fucking child, walking back and forth, pounding on the walls, and this naturally attracts Larry's attention, so Julia has to use her feminine wiles to distract him.
Just don't go up to the attic. My pussy's open.
Basically, I probably haven't had sex with you in quite some time. How about we go for some standard vanilla on the bed?
Which Larry's really dumb, because this should be a red flag that's like, okay, something's in that attic.
Yeah, like, what's up?
I love how this scene is, like, emblematic of how both Cotton Boys are just fucking idiots. You've got Frank who, like, dude, you have no skin. You maybe need to lie low for a little bit.
Right.
But instead, like you said, he's throwing a temper tantrum in the attic where clearly, someone's going to hear him. And then, all it takes is a little peek under the skirt for old Larry to be like, well, let's forget what I clearly heard coming from the attic and we'll just, divert to the bedroom.
But if Larry's stupidity at like buying into Julia's bullshit is not enough, we have about 30 seconds of her going, no, yes. I can't. And he is still going to town, like motorboating her titties. Like, I don't.
Yeah. No, he's terrible. And I love to, like, Frank is just as abhorrent here. I appreciate that we're meant to be scared that he is going to kill Larry or maybe her or something like that. And I'm just there with you, Brian, thinking, you don't have any skin on. This is just an ego trip for you. Like, He just wants to get off on the fact that he can creep out of the shadows, skin a rat, and maybe get her upset.
Ooh, I do think too, like with these skinless people, it looks worse. And by worse, I mean in a good way. When they're wearing clothes,
and it's seeping through. Yes.
That contrast. Yeah.
I mean, there is a shot of Claire Higgins' sans skin, spoilers for the second film, where she puts on an all-white suit that gets bloody, and it is one of my favorite scenes in all of horror.
Wild.
Oh, it's so good.
It's
okay.
so gross.
So, obviously, Larry is perturbed by this behavior, so the next day at lunch, he asks Kirsty if she can swing by the house sometime. Just check on my wife, because you two have such a great relationship.
There is humor in... this isn't a funny movie, but Barker has many moments of humor. It is in this, where he's like, who knows, maybe all she needs is somebody to talk to. And then we cut to Frank talking to Julia.
I even like the moment watching the boxing match. Like, it's kind of a little bit hokey, but I don't know. I like the fact that knowing everything that Julia has just gone through in terms of just like mutilating these men with hammers, she's like, boxing's not a big deal anymore.
I love it. I mean, it's part of her arc, right? But it's subtle. It's not hit you over the head with a fucking hammer, obvious. It's just like, if you're paying attention, oh, look, certain things aren't bothering her anymore. And also, she's drinking drinks like a badass bitch because she's just killing people all the time now, which is basically where we're up to. So Frank is now at the point where he's like, I would like to consider killing my brother. So Julia picks up victim number 3 that we see. And of course, this is exactly when Kirsty is arriving at the house to check on her. So she follows them inside. Don't know why, Kirsty. You've seen enough damning evidence. You could just leave at this point.
I'm sorry, the damning evidence is just, hey, Dad, your wife is bringing a man into the house.
Exactly. Not, hey, Dad, your wife is bringing men home so that she can feed them to your skinless brother.
Well, I will say that I am surprised that we get this much happening in this scene. Like, the movie really takes a hard pivot after this, because this is also when the movie becomes more of Kirsty's film and not Julia's. Yeah,
this is the transition point. And I do think it's such an interesting, careful balance, right? Because we have to fear for Kirsty, who is a character we don't really know all that well, because we haven't spent that much time with her. And also, we're seeing Frank and Julia from a different perspective. It's not Julia's story anymore, it's now Kirsty's. And Julia and Frank look like fucking monsters now. So Kirsty ends up basically narrowly escaping because she manages to get her hands on the puzzle box. She gets to hear the come to daddy line, because of course that will be her tip-off later. And she throws the box out the window, and that is enough of a distraction that she can escape past Frank and Julia, and then she, immediately passes out from shock on the sidewalk.
But again, another bit of humor, she's walking down the street, who does she walk by but 2 nuns who are just looking at her like she is crazy.
So, we know, having talked about less so in Lords of Illusion, but definitely in Nightbreed, Barker's not super fond of religion, so I do see this as a bit of a condemnation, like, yeah, you could pass nuns on the street after what you've encountered, and they won't be able to help you.
Yeah.
So she wakes up in the hospital. She has no idea how she's gotten there. She is mansplained by a doctor who does not believe that she has experienced anything. And then she makes the fatal mistake, touching that box.
I don't understand how this box works. I don't know what the puzzle is, because you just pull it in half, it looks like, and you just put it back together the same way almost. But I can see how switching the film to focus on Kirsty would be maybe underwhelming to some, especially because, as you said, Joe, we haven't spent much time with her. But I will tell you that Kirsty is one of the most resourceful final girls I've ever seen, and she is smart. And so, if anything, it makes me wish I had more of her before this, but I'm fine with this switch because Kirsty is such a strong character for me from this point moving forward.
This also represents an interesting area where it really kind of is, I think, muddying the waters of consent. Okay. Because this is where you're introduced to the idea that the box wants you to open it, and it is going to give you a gentle pull in that direction, know. But I think there's also something to be said about the fact that it's not pulling at things that aren't there.
Right.
So it's reaching out to those parts of yourselves that maybe you keep tucked in a very deep, dark corner, and it's letting those things start to come out, and you see that with kind of that, she's kind of got that almost dumb glazed over smile when she's looking at the box. Like there's something that it's releasing some kind of endorphins or something. And I think it's addressed, obviously I don't want to get too far down that rabbit hole, but in part 2, they address it a little bit more succinctly where, they say it's not hands that opens us or that call to us, it's desire.
Yes.
And I think you see that unspoken here.
The box is definitely an object of seduction. I mean, we haven't really talked about the look of it. I think the props to the prop master, because it is such a striking and memorable object, right? Like, it's basically a deadly Rubik's Cube that you do not want to fuck with. But there's something so intriguing and powerful about it that you can understand why you would gravitate to it. But this is why I start to think that Kirsty is actually akin to Frank, because she undergoes the same journey as him. She, like Julia, has her own Larry in boring-ass Steve. And guess what? Like, we see them, not quite in bed. Like, she's in bed and he's on the floor. Clearly, their relationship is not particularly sexual, or maybe it just hasn't matured to that point yet. But you get this impression that she is interested in something more than this, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that's why she opens the box. And you're right, Chase. This is also our big introduction to her, right? This is another scene where I think people could look at it and say, well, why did we need this scene with the engineer in the hallway? Is it that valuable? Sure, it comes back at the end of the film. But I think that this is 100% to show Kirsty's resourcefulness, because she can outrun this monster.
Yeah.
And it's a great sequence. It's very exciting and fun. And then she immediately has to pivot and use her brain to broker a deal when the Cenobites arrive.
I will say, I wrote in my notes, I was like, well, she got the good opening, I guess, because no hooks for her. She just hits a door.
And a giant penis monster chasing after her. But,
right?
I mean, this is that situation where, you know, to borrow a phrase from Trace, like the fact that she didn't diarrhea herself all over the floor.
Oh, the subtitle of the episode. There
I
it is.
think
Diarrhea in
speaks
her
to...
feet, in her shoes.
But it's funny the way they find a way around that in terms of, like, yeah, she doesn't get the hooks, but I think it's also telling about how much stronger that both Julia and Kirsty are than Frank. Frank opens that box and he's fucking done immediately. Kirsty opens it and she manages to, you know, figure out a way to survive it. Now, again, she didn't get the hooks right off the bat, but I mean... It's not to say that a giant, big, toothy, you know, demon penis monster, that's also equally threatening.
Right.
You know, so the fact that didn't get her, I think, is telling.
Well, and like, but honestly, like, because the Chatterer comes up to her and shoves his fingers in her mouth.
Yeah, it's an oral rape for sure.
But yeah, I mean, again, like, watching the cogs turn in her head as she tries to figure her way out of this. Because again, she's on the ticking clock. They are literally about to take her to their dimension to go fucking torture the hell out of her, you know, do whatever they want.
And also, she doesn't know what the fuck is going on.
Yes! Yes! Like, all she knows is that Frank is back. He looks the way he does, and he wants that box. She puts all this together during this scene, and that immediately, I'm like, ooh, good for you, girl. You're doing a real good job.
Yeah, I would be, my brain synapses would just like be, nothing. You know, they talk about fight, flight, or freeze. I would be freezing and dead. Yeah, I would not survive that situation.
It's really, I mean, again, the more I'm getting into cosmic horror, I'm like, oh my god, the fear of like, where are they taking me? What is going to happen? And it's for eternity. It is horrifying. Like, this is a terrifying position to be in, and I'm so glad she gets out of it.
Yeah.
Trace, like, once again, the evolution of this movie, I never considered this as cosmic horror, and now I love considering this as cosmic horror.
Right?
That's amazing. I love it.
So we haven't really talked about the fact that we're also getting to see the Cenobites. Like, this is also their big sort of coming out moment, because we previously only glimpsed them either not saying any dialogue or just sort of operating for a couple of seconds at a time. I want to talk a little bit about just how good they look, even in better lighting.
I was thinking the exact same thing.
The costumes are iconic. The makeup job is fantastic. Even the way that Barker shoots the transition, so we see the tiling on the hospital wall switch to black so that we can pump steam out between. And it is so... it's just so fucking visually captivating, this whole sequence. And we're having to watch Kirsty do everything on the fly. It's so good.
The way he lingers on the Cenobites' faces in this well-lit shot, he's like, I dare you to find the seams on this.
Right?
Like, I dare you to find the cracks in the facade. Like, you are not going to have to suspend disbelief. You are going to believe that Cenobites are a real thing. I promise you.
And then, of course, we got Doug Bradley just biting into this dialogue. Like, it ends with this pushing on him where he's like, we will tear your soul apart, which is the tagline for the film.
And I always forget too, because the first half of that line is delivered by the female Cenobite, because she says, but if you cheat us.
I love her too. Grace Kirby is so good in this. I always wish the female Cenobite A had a fucking name and B got more to do.
Well, also because the wound on her neck is very vaginal, right?
Yes, we did talk about this a little bit with Angelique when we talked about the fourth one, because it's like variations of this. Yeah, I mean, very female coded, but also I would argue a lot of sort of androgynous kind of like gender fluidity in the garb, like, because Pinhead also has like a kind of vaginal stomach wound in his exposed stomach area.
I mean, we're all on the same page that this is a gender fluid pansexual polycule.
Yes.
Right? Okay.
Any hole's a goal.
Oh, God.
Especially if you're a Cenobite. You're like, everything. oh, there isn't a hole there? Let me make one.
We'll make one. Fuck it. Yeah.
Yes, they will make it and fuck it. Okay, so Kirsty has escaped, at least from Julia and Frank's perspective. They have no idea where she's gone. So, of course, they worry that they're going to get discovered. And this is when Frank says, okay, we need to kill Larry. So we see that this is interesting. We don't see this murder. It's off screen.
But we know it happens.
We 100% know what's going on. And then immediately thereafter, they consummate their relationship for the first time since he's back.
And so this is, again, she's fucking what looks like her husband, but for with steamy, passionate sex for the first time ever.
Right. But let's not forget. Okay, so I'm bringing back Mark Richard Adams. So thinking about Frank in this perspective, he restores himself by stealing and wearing his brother's skin, and then he finally gets to have sex with Julia. And this feels like this desperate bid to reaffirm his heterosexuality, right? Like, okay, well, I'm back to normal, baby, so I can get back to fucking women. And he's also still doing weird shit, right? Because he's gonna try to do an incestuous rape of Kirsty. So his sexuality is almost destabilized, right? Like he's desperately trying to prove his manhood, but also he's refusing to just go off with Julia.
It's also interesting that now he's become this amalgam of Frank and Larry, so they've kind of come together. So it's, I don't know, she can kind of almost see it as the best of both worlds. Although I don't know if it was ever like necessarily a physical attraction that she had to Larry. It was more his stability, but I don't know, maybe there's something for her there to be able to see like, oh, I get kind of both Larry and Frank now.
I mean, I am a little confused as to how she doesn't pull his skin off during the fucking, because it's not that tight. And also, he has like a clear line of where the skin meets the skin.
I love it.
Like he looks like the boy from Little Monsters, like the guy at the end who's like, he's dressed up, he's a little boy, but he's clearly like, it's a little boy's face like pasted onto a monster behind it. Like same vibe from this, where it's like, this is not a very foolproof disguise skin suit that you're wearing.
Also, this is Mission Impossible, so we don't have fucking voice things that can change your voice, but yet here we are.
They also play pretty fast and loose with like the rules of regeneration in this series, because it
takes him forever, the whole movie
takes him forever. He winds up getting, like, when he sucks the last bit out of, to become whole with Larry, he looks like Larry. But in the next movie, when Julia is picking up a bunch of randos and getting their skin, she gets her old skin when she comes back.
Though I actually always read this as he literally flays Larry and wears his skin like a suit, not that he becomes like Larry after as his final transformation. Because again, that line, that blood red line across his head, that's like, okay, he's wearing his skin as a suit. He's not actually like, he didn't grow this skin in this face.
Well, then if that's what he did a pretty fucking good job. There's some seams, but the fact that he took an entire his brother's entire skin and like, aside from like some blood seams along the hairline, like he did a pretty good job.
Well, that's why we couldn't watch that scene, because it would have taken like 12 hours to get over.
Well, and here's the even more disturbing thing. The reason we don't see it is because Larry would have still been alive. Because if Frank had have stuck his fingers in, the skin would have been all withered, like pruny, right? Because we see what happens to Julia and all these other men. So he I guess he could have killed Larry and then taken the skin off.
Julia could have hammered him.
But yeah, no, I read it the same way, because that's why we always get these repeated images of Frank with the pocket knife.
Oh, yes. Oh my God, though. Wouldn't you want like a butcher knife for that shit? Jesus.
It would have taken 12 hours for sure.
But leave it to Frank. He would have used the switchblade just because he's that kind of douchebag.
Oh, yeah.
100%. Yeah.
He's like, I don't have to overcompensate for anything. I have all the equipment I need.
Yeah, I definitely don't have a limp dick or anything, for sure.
I mean, he definitely does not, based on what we've seen in this film.
Well, back in the day, I don't know.
Yeah.
Although Julia does look pretty satisfied when Kirsty shows up. So, speaking of, Kirsty returns to the house because she thinks she needs to get her dad, and of course, then she's caught in this, like, interesting three-way between Julia, Frank posing as Larry, and then the Cenobites, who have also returned.
We also get this weird, because again, we have to go back to Steve as he goes to find Kirsty at the hospital, and
don't care.
We get the second instance, though, of this nurse who just walks out on people as they're mid-sentence. I don't know why it's here. It's just funny to me. I'm just like, okay, she walks out on Kirsty, and then she walks out on Steve mid-sentence.
And then she walks into The Exorcist 3.
Yes.
Oh, God.
And then out of that movie.
Decapitated.
That nurse had a day.
So Frank is legitimately terrible at roleplay. Clearly not one of his better sex games, because he gives himself away almost immediately. And, I mean, he doesn't even care, right? He doesn't keep up the pretense at all. I guess why would you bother? Because he feels like...
Oh, he's too cocky.
Yeah, it goes back to the arrogance of, like, I can't lose. And it's like,
Yeah.
dude, you should know from, like, very recent experience that you totally can fucking lose. And badly. Like, you should not be this confident in your ability to navigate these situations.
Yeah.
He learned nothing from his time in the Cenobite dimension.
No. And that's what makes Frank such a frustrating but also wholly believable and almost relatable character. So just like, dude got flayed and then sent to a hell dimension potentially, comes back and is still as cocky and confident as ever. Like, wow, it's impressive. He learned nothing. And of course, it seems like Julia didn't really learn much either, because she put her faith in the wrong man and he stabs her and kills her. And then in the ultimate betrayal, he can't just leave her alone. He also has to suck her dry.
This always rubs me. I get that it does kind of go in line with Frank's character, but it always kind of like kills me that this is because don't you want the end of this to be between Kirsty and Julia? Like, don't you wish Frank had been the one to get offed first?
I mean, I would if we didn't have the sequel, but I feel like that's what makes it so satisfying. And especially like for folks who haven't seen number 2, Frank does come back in the sequel, and the way that he is handled is just chef's kiss perfect. The way that Julia does not give a fuck about him. Which
is also interesting when you consider, you talk about, Joe, how you consider part 2 like a companion piece as opposed to just a sequel. And does this movie, if there's no sequel, you lose a lot of that agency that we have given to Julia, because of where things go in the sequel. But if this was just how things ended for the Julia Cotton saga, that's anticlimactic and a missed opportunity.
And even punitive, right? Like, I love Claire Higgins' delivery of the line, not me. Like, it almost breaks my heart, and that's how I realize how much I fucking love the character. And not just because she's bad and she looks fabulous doing it, but because she is a whole person. And this is the ultimate act of betrayal to me. Like, this is the moment of the film that hurts the most to me.
Yeah.
So now we're down to some stocky cat and mouse shit, because even though Frank said he didn't want to do that, he proceeds to stalk Kirsty from room to room.
So this is a slasher.
Well, but the funny thing is that you think, I mean, obviously she's in danger. She's finding maggot-ridden corpses in the room where Julia stashed them, but this is also her figuring her shit out because she knows that she needs to get him to self-identify so that the Cenobites will appear.
Because she's wired.
Which is what she finally gets him to do, because he does the fucking come to daddy, and she's like, you're Frank, and he's like, yeah, I'm fucking Frank, because he's got the bravado like an idiot. And that's when they show up, and I love, too, that they're playful enough that they will let him almost get to her with the knife before they sink that first hook into his hand.
Gotcha. Yeah.
Just like, oh, you thought you were going to get... No, we're going to pull you back.
Not so fast, Frank.
We haven't given Andrew Robinson very much credit, but he fully transforms into Frank in the back half of this film. And it is a night and day difference in terms of his performance. It's so good.
No, I know I made a joke about like his voice it should not be his voice, but I'm glad it is, because this performance to me would be diminished if we had the Frank actor dubbing over this.
Yeah.
And the way like his lip snarls when he just gives that "come to daddy," like it's so creepy. It's so well delivered.
So good.
Also, he came up with the Jesus Wept line because originally it was "fuck you,"
which is so iconic, right? Jesus Wept is such a classic line.
And then he just blows up.
Love it. I mean, you talked about how wet and gooey this film is. He is still not fully whole. Like, we talked about Kirsty earlier before she escaped from the house the first time. She does, like, fully stick her hand into his guts.
Gross.
So good.
Yeah, and the chunk she takes out of his cheek, too, is just...
Oh, yeah.
Oh, and it's just like flapping on his face for the entire 10 minutes he's left on screen.
So good. So Frank has been dispatched, but if you thought the Cenobites were going to let Kirsty go, the female Cenobite already said no one gets away from us. So we now have to dispatch each of them individually with their own unique puzzle.
Okay, Kirsty is a smart final girl. She's really resourceful. I don't buy for one fucking second she would have been able to figure all this out to get rid of these Cenobites one at a time.
I think the only thing I can think is if you want to give some kind of a justification for that, like if the box has that ability to compel you to kind of draw out your desires to solve it, like maybe it kind of has that intuitive like connection to if your desire is like, oh shit, I don't want this,
right?
And you're not a stupid asshole like Frank, then the box will kind of give you that like that shortcut to kind of like just maybe in the back of your mind let you know like, hey, you brought them here by opening it, see what happens if you close it.
I just have this mental image of Kirsty sitting at like the table at the beginning with Frank and the dealer with Pinhead, and she's like, okay, so how do you do? Okay, well, you just take the box and you rub your little finger around the circle right here, and this thing's gonna pop out, Kirsty.
It's like when you like are learning a very like complicated board game with your friends and you're all trying to figure out at the same time but it's with Pinhead.
But also really good for honest reaction. So I do hate the fact that Pinhead is not the final one she has to deal with. She's the second one she gets rid of.
Right.
But he pops up behind her and he's like, we have such sights to show you. And she just looks at him, hesitates, and goes, shit!
Kirsty's reactions are 1,000,000% genuine throughout all of this. She looks frantic as fuck, and you're just like, you got this, girl. I believe in you. You're smart. You could do it.
Still capable, though. You know, again, not diarrheaing herself. Like, she's figuring it out.
Right.
And then also, you know, gives you that opportunity for some of the only non-makeup visual effects, you know, where you get to see the blue lightning or whatever you want to call it come out and surround them, which, if I remember correctly, was actually done like Barker and like his editor or something, like got drunk, spent a weekend and hand drew on the cells to do all of that.
Oh, that was probably Tony Randall, the guy that directed 2 and like came in and like helped them like reshoot all the stuff.
I think you're right. Yeah. But yeah, apparently they just knocked that, like they got like shit faced drunk and just like knocked that out in a hotel room.
Awesome. Well, also, hey, I like all of this, but what do y'all think of her? I'm going to call it a fist fight with the engineer.
Oh, I fucking love it.
Really?
Steve shows up. He is so useless. He almost dies. She has to save him. And then, he doesn't listen to her. So we open the door. There's the engineer. And then we get this fucking just slapdash, like grabbing for the puzzle box, but not before Steve gets punched in the face by the engineer and then elbowed to the side by Kirsty.
Yeah.
I think this verges a little bit too far into silliness for me. I mean,
it is a little silly. Yeah.
I think it's entertaining, but I wrote him out. I was like, this is really dumb.
And I think if it was just Kirsty, it wouldn't work that well for me. But the fact that it's that juxtaposition of, like, again, seeing Steve, who's clearly out of his element in whatever room he's in, he's out of his element. And seeing that contrasted against Kirsty, who has, like, literally been through hell. And just the fact that it's like, dude, get out of my way.
Yes.
I got this. Like, I think it's that final cherry on top of a movie where it's like, inconsequential men, please get the fuck out of the way.
Yeah. I have seen this scene in particular get referenced often in collaboration with people saying that this is a slasher film. So it's like, well, this is when she ascends to become a true final girl and she doesn't need men and this kind of stuff. And I'm like, yeah, but you can also just have a female protagonist who is strong and independent. Like, she's not grabbing a phallic weapon and stabbing the shit out of this thing.
In fact, she's grabbing a box.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh my God, Brian, I love it.
That's good. That's really good.
Perfection, Ryan.
I'm just going to go now because I'm never going to top that.
Yeah, that was perfect.
Even
it was
Frank
perfect comedic timing.
Oh my God, the puns.
But yeah, so they escape.
The house basically blows up / goes up in flames. And then Kirsty's like, cool, I'm done with this shit. She tries to burn the box. And this is when, hey, remember that derelict character? Yeah. He's back. He grabs the box. He melts after catching fire, which also looks great. and then turns into a giant winged bone monster thing, which doesn't look super great.
A giant winged bone monster. This was a late edition, by the way. Clive Barker just wanted something really threatening to end the movie on, so he came up with this.
Sure. I mean, this shows up in the comics a lot, which Brian and I also talk about on that limited miniseries. We have an entire episode dedicated to the comics, and this ends up becoming part of the visual iconography of a lot of the Hellraiser stories. But here, you're kind of like, okay, this is interesting. It's a little undercooked.
Brian, I know you're here with us on this episode, but Joe, for a split second, every time you say me and Brian, I was like, your husband? Like, he watches this shit?
No, my Brian doesn't understand anything about these movies. He's like, why are you watching this for the millionth time? He's like, I love how much you love it. I don't understand the appeal. I'm like, but Julia Cotton.
Has he watched it in its entirety?
No, he like walks through, and that's about as much as he wants.
Oh my God, you're such a Steve. Leave me alone.
Honey, we're just going to watch one movie, but you put on 1 and 2 because they really are 2 parts of a whole.
This is true. Yeah.
Just double feature them.
Just find a way to edit out the end credits of part 1 and the beginning credits of part 2.
Right.
It just continues. Oh my God, give me the super cut.
It's just the fan cut, yeah. Okay, and basically the monster deposits the box presumably back in Morocco so that we can start all over again. And that is the end of Hellraiser.
Yay! Brian, give us your final thoughts.
Masterpiece, no notes, highest rating I can give it. It's my favorite movie of all time, and it's, again, just talking about this with you has proved that every time I revisit this, either through watching it or talking about it with somebody else, there's something else for me to find that will make me enjoy this movie more. And today I get to walk away with Hellraiser as cosmic horror before they ever go to space. So thank you for that, Trace. I appreciate it. But yeah,
you are welcome.
Absolutely adore this movie.
I'm pretty vocal about how much I adore the second film in this franchise, and it's always been my favorite. But I will say that this is the first time I've watched Hellraiser where I have come close to being like, maybe it is better than the second one.
Mm-hmm.
I really like this. I can't. Every time I've watched it, I found something more about it. I've noticed something different that I'm like, oh, I do like that a lot. This is a masterclass in horror, and this is the most I've ever liked this film on a watch. I do love it as well. It admittedly is not one I care to watch a lot because I don't find it particularly enjoyable.
Yeah, like it's not gonna get your blood pumping or anything.
Yeah, well, maybe that's why I like the second one, because the second one's very much, I mean, again, we have the status quo, like Kirsty knows what's going on, and it's definitely more bombastic. It's not an action movie, but it's more action oriented, so that to me is a more fun watch than this one.
You wouldn't call this like comfort food horror.
Right, and I would call the second one that.
Okay.
Which I can kind of see. There's something a little bit more, I don't know, something similar to how, like, the difference between Alien and Aliens. Like,
I think, too, for me, I mean, I that's why I think Scream 2 is better than Scream 1, or I'm sorry, why I prefer Scream 2 to Scream 1, not why it's better. I just like starting a movie where the status quo is already done. Our lead character from the first movie already knows the whole gist. We don't have to go through all this setup. So I think for a first-time viewing, it works for me. But for a second-time viewing, I'm like, oh, I want to move past all this, like, learning, figuring things out type stuff.
Yeah,
you're not a big origin story guy.
No, hate it. Fucking hate it. I mean, sorry, I don't like it, but like, but Joe,
yes,
you close us out.
Yeah, very similar reactions to Brian. It's my horror origin. It's also my favorite horror film of all time. Like Brian, I discover new things about it constantly. I just think everything is on point. Like the performances, the production design, Barker's camera work. And also, this movie is just so fucking queer. Like, we barely scratched the surface of all of the different interpretations and queer readings you can have of this movie. But, like, obviously, Cenobites, super queer. Frank, queer. Julia, unorthodox. Kirsty's dabbling with it, man. I just think there's so much to discuss and appreciate about this movie. And the fact that it's Clive Barker and the fact that it's his debut feature film. I think it's just one of the most important horror films, and I'm so happy I got to talk about it.
And we didn't really talk about just the structure of it as a film in general, but I do think this one was paced expertly.
Even when it has that transition between Julia and Kirsty, like, it could feel like the film has to restart. Oh, we're introducing this character and giving her more to do. It doesn't feel that way. It just feels seamless.
Yeah. Well, okay. Before we announce what we're covering next week, Bryan, first, thank you for coming on, and second, let everyone know where they can find you on social media.
Of course, you can get me on Twitter at Evil Taylor Hicks. Pretty much that's about it for me when it comes to social media. That's more than enough. So yeah, in terms of my work, like you said earlier, you can find me. I've got a monthly interview column called Let's Scare Bryan to Death through Daily Dead. Both of you have done installments of that, which were both lovely. So, folks, if you haven't seen that, go check them out. And yeah, I've got a couple of recurring columns in Roomorg magazine. You can see... what do I do? Shadowland, where it just kind of takes the historical origins from certain movies and dives into those a little bit. And I also do a short horror review roundup called Shortcuts, which is a lot of fun because I really like being able to showcase short horror, which, Joe, I know that's also, well, actually for both of you, that's a sweet spot for you too. So yeah, check that out.
Well, if you want to get in touch with us, you can reach us on Twitter and Instagram at HorrorQueers. Shoot us an email at horrorqueers@gmail.com. Find us on Letterboxd to keep track of all the films we've covered. Go to our YouTube channel to check out our interviews with various horror filmmakers, as well as our monthly hangouts where we talk about hot-button issues with some of our journalistic peers. And if you want to chat with other listeners, please join our Facebook HorrorQueers group. But if you also want to show us some love, you can go to rate and review us on your podcatcher of choice. We do love Apple Podcasts and Spotify reviews. But on the flip side, if you want even more content, support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/horrorqueers. This month, we've got episodes on our favorite horror movie sequences in non-horror movies, the social media slasher movie Sissy, the horror prequel double feature you didn't know you needed with Orphan First Kill and Ty West Pearl, and an audio commentary on Wishmaster, just in time for its 25th anniversary.
Talk about be careful what you wish for.
I saw that for the first time last year, and I shockingly enjoyed it quite a bit.
Yeah. Again, practical effects.
Mm-hmm. But Joe, what are we talking about next week?
Well, speaking of remakes and also films that get better each time you watch them, Trace, it is finally time to tackle the Suspiria remake from 2018.
Oh boy, I have only seen this movie once, and it was my first viewing. Well, obviously my first viewing. I'm sorry. I have only seen this movie once.
Yeah, I've seen it a couple of times, and every single time I'm like, yep, once you figure out the pacing and you know where it's going to go, oh boy, does this baby play well.
I'm really excited because it is a film where I was like, I was okay with it on a first watch, but yeah, it's been one where I've always been like, oh, I need to see it again to like watch it on its own terms, like knowing what it is. Mm-hmm. But it's like 3 hours long, so
it is, yeah.
But until next week, everyone, we can cross out once and for all until we get to that sequel, Hellraiser.
Indeed, and cross out HorrorQueers.
Atlas Avenue, a long stretch of road that encompasses everything the city of Kennett Heights has to offer. Neon lights, traffic, crime, the hustle and bustle of everyday life, and the craziest of characters. My office was above it all. My name is James Locke, and I'm a PI.
Hello, Mr. J. How the hell you doing today?
Good, Edith. Nearly every year I have a new case. New people to meet, new clues to discover, and new problems to solve. But I do it the old-fashioned way. No technology. Nothing post-1950. Hell, I don't even listen to podcasts, but you should. Atlas Avenue Beat is a spoof of the film noir genre with goofy characters, tons of wordplay, and non-stop raunchy humor. There's also 3 whole seasons out right now with more on the way. Just search for Atlas Avenue Beat wherever you listen to podcasts or visit us online at bloody.fm.
It was late in the afternoon when the professor and I took our way towards the east, whence I knew Jonathan was coming.
Jonathan Harker has asked me to note this, as he says he is hardly equal to the task, and he wants an exact record kept.
Dear Madam Mina, I have read your husband's so wonderful diary. Strange and terrible as it is true. I will pledge my life on it.
God preserve my sanity, for to this I am reduced. Safety and the assurance of safety are things of the past.
I am in hopes that I shall see more of you at Castle Dracula. Listen to Regarding Dracula wherever you listen to podcasts, or find us online at bloody.fm.